What if the next Great War doesn't begin with a bang, but with silence? In this immersive, slow-paced narrative, we explore the modern world's most fragile threads, geopolitical rivalries, old alliances strained by time, and the quiet erosion of global trust. Over nearly 2 hours, this analysis takes you through the hidden architecture of peace, the rise of cyberwarfare, the return of great power politics, and the lingering scars of past wars. No alarms, no hype, just a thoughtful journey through the questions that shape our age. Could the world fall into war again? And what would it look like if it did? Close your eyes. Listen closely. History isn't just about the past, it's also the calm before a storm. Part 1, A World at the Edge of Memory. In the early morning hours of a quiet, overcast day, you could be forgiven for thinking the world had finally settled. Cities hum with commerce, satellites arc silently overhead, and world leaders gather in solemn chambers to shake hands and sign accords. But beneath this facade of normalcy, the world carries a different kind of tension, one that is invisible, humming low and steady like the warning thrum before a storm. It is a tension built not on declarations or armies marching through streets, but on networks, miscalculations, ideology, and silence. To ask whether World War III will happen is to peer into a mirror we hoped was shattered by the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The 20th century scarred the human psyche with 2 catastrophic wars. Those wars were not just conflicts of tanks and trenches, they were total collapses of the systems meant to prevent them. Alliances failed. Empires crumbled. Ideologies hardened. And in the space of 3 decades, humanity twice danced on the edge of ruin. Today, the world is different, but not immune. The reasons wars erupt are older than nations: fear, power, pride, survival. And while the battlegrounds have changed, from muddy fields to cyberspace, from warships to satellites, the underlying currents remain disturbingly familiar. As we begin this exploration, it is important to understand that World War III would not look like the wars before it. It would not begin with a single declaration, nor would it unfold in a linear fashion. It would likely be a chain reaction, a misinterpreted missile test, a cyber attack attributed to the wrong actor, a drone strike too close to the border. And before the dust can settle, alliances are triggered, red lines crossed, and the machinery of destruction begins to move. But there are also forces pulling in the opposite direction. The very memory of past wars acts as a brake. The interconnectedness of the modern global economy binds adversaries in webs of mutual dependence. And in the background, millions of ordinary people simply want peace, want to raise their children, grow their businesses, and watch sunsets without fear of sirens. This story we're about to tell is not one of panic, but of clarity. Not one of inevitability, but of understanding. Over the next chapters, we'll walk through the shifting tectonics of global power, from the icy corridors of NATO to the highlands of Taiwan, from the data centers of Silicon Valley to the deserts of Iran. We'll explore how cyberwarfare has blurred the lines between peace and war, how old alliances are being tested by new ambitions, and how the voices of the world's people are increasingly drowned out by the roar of geopolitical gamesmanship. And yet, this is not a hopeless narrative. Because within the danger lies the opportunity to choose differently. To look at the lessons etched in history and remember why they matter. To understand not only the moves of nations, but the fears that drive them. To recognize that war is not just fought by armies, it is fueled by narratives, by economic pressures, by identity, and by forgetting. So as we begin, picture the world not as a globe turning serenely in space, but as a vast and ancient machine. A machine made of treaties, memories, ambitions, grudges, wires, wealth, oil, algorithms, and fire. Some parts move with purpose. Others grind chaotically. And somewhere deep within its core, a spark waits, unlit, but watching. We begin not with an answer, but with a question. Not with certainty, but with caution. Because the future of peace, like war, does not come from fate. It comes from choice. And choice, like history, begins in the telling. Part 2, Echoes in the Architecture of Peace. To understand whether the world is drifting toward another great war, we must first trace the foundations of peace that have held since the end of the Second World War. These are not simply paper treaties or handshakes captured in black and white photographs. They are the architecture of restraint, deliberately constructed over decades by a generation that had looked over the cliff of destruction and resolved, with trembling hands, to build something better. In the ashes of 1945, when Europe was a graveyard and Asia lay shattered, the world's powers gathered to write rules. Institutions were born not out of idealism, but necessity. The United Nations, the Bretton Woods system, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, all were conceived as bulwarks against the chaos that had twice consumed the globe. The idea was simple: if nations are tied together in trade, in diplomacy, in forums where grievances can be aired before bullets are fired, then perhaps war could be prevented, not just managed, but made obsolete. And for a while, it worked. The Cold War, for all its threats and proxy conflicts, never erupted into a full-scale confrontation between the superpowers. Nuclear deterrence, for all its horror, froze ambition into caution. The 20th century's second half became a paradox of quiet tension. While smaller nations bled, the great powers kept their swords in their sheaths, not out of mercy, but out of mutual fear. But time erodes even the strongest foundations. The alliances born in that post-war moment, NATO in the West, the Warsaw Pact in the East, reflected a world that no longer exists. The Soviet Union collapsed. China rose from its century of humiliation into an economic and strategic colossus. Former colonies claimed independence, only to find themselves caught in new struggles for identity and stability. And the institutions that once anchored the world began to show cracks, not because they were weak, but because they were stretched beyond what their creators could have imagined. Today, the United Nations struggles to enforce its own resolutions. The World Trade Organization falters under the weight of nationalist protectionism. NATO faces internal discord. The very frameworks meant to hold the world together are now battlegrounds themselves, contested by emerging powers who never had a seat at their creation, and questioned by older powers grown weary of carrying the burdens of leadership. In this unraveling, old ghosts return. Nationalism, once discredited by the carnage it had caused, rises again in speeches and slogans. Borders once opened by globalism now harden with fences. The idea that conflict might be avoided through mutual understanding is replaced by doctrines of deterrence and dominance. Trust, that invisible currency of peace, is in short supply. And yet, even now, the architecture stands. Bent, but not broken. The very existence of forums where enemies still speak, the protocols that guide military behavior, the fact that the term World War III still evokes dread rather than excitement, these are testaments to how deeply the memory of destruction lingers in the human psyche. But memory fades. And younger generations, born in times of relative peace, may not feel the weight of that legacy. They did not huddle under desks during nuclear drills. They did not return home to cities turned to rubble. For them, war is more often a screen, a statistic, or rumor. And in that distance lies danger. For peace is not a default state. It is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of effort, constant, quiet, often thankless. It is diplomats arguing late into the night. It is treaties renewed and military exercises de-escalated. It is the hard, unglamorous work of keeping civilization from devouring itself. And so, as we explore the possibility of future war, we must also examine the present peace, not as a guarantee, but as a precious, fragile inheritance. One that requires care. One that is easier to take for granted than to rebuild once lost. The world today stands not at the precipice, but on a plateau, one that could tilt toward harmony or horror. Whether we rise or fall will depend not on weapons, but on wisdom. Not on strength alone, but on the ability to remember why peace was built in the first place, and the cost of letting it fall. Part 3, The Shadow of Empires. Empires, though often relegated to textbooks and ruins, never truly disappear. Their shadows stretch long into the present, shaping borders, identities, and grievances that simmer beneath the surface of modern diplomacy. To understand today's geopolitical tensions, the frictions that might one day ignite into something more, we must first step into these shadows. For it is here that the seeds of future conflict often lie, quiet but restless. Across the globe, from Europe's ornate capitals to Asia's fast-rising metropolises, there lingers a memory of once great dominions. Russia remembers the Tsars and the Soviet Union, not merely as pages of history, but as echoes of pride and unfinished ambition. China recalls centuries of dynastic splendor and humiliation at the hands of foreign powers. Turkey stands on the bones of the Ottoman Empire, its current borders a fraction of what once was. Iran carries within it the ancient pulse of Persia, and dreams quietly of influence once lost. These memories are not benign. They shape foreign policy, military postures, and even national education. They fuel dreams of resurgence, sometimes framed as restoration, sometimes as revenge. Leaders invoke them not merely for nostalgia, but to justify action. When territory is disputed, when influence is challenged, it is often not just land or leverage that's at stake, it is a sense of identity, of historical justice. Russia's actions in Crimea, for example, were not only about strategy or access to warm water ports. They were also a statement that the post-Soviet order was not irreversible, that Moscow could reclaim what it considered rightfully part of its sphere. China's assertiveness in the South China Sea, and its stance toward Taiwan, are not merely about geography, they are entwined with national pride, with narratives of restoration after a century of humiliation. And in each of these cases, the shadow of empire darkens diplomacy, making compromise harder, and miscalculation more likely. The trouble is, these shadow empires rarely overlap cleanly. They collide. The same piece of land, the same maritime corridor, the same symbolic monument, can hold meaning for multiple powers, each convinced of its historic claim. And when identity is on the line, reason often falters. Logic bows to emotion. Strategic patience frays into impatience. In the modern world, where maps are supposed to be settled and war an option of last resort, these imperial shadows create strange, dangerous tensions. They pull nations backward, even as technology and economy push them forward. And in this tug of war, peace can begin to unravel, not with a single shot, but with the slow erosion of mutual respect. The international system, forged after World War II, was designed for a world of sovereign states, not clashing civilizational legacies. It assumed that history could be reconciled, or at least set aside. But today, more and more leaders appeal to history not as a lesson in restraint, but as a tool of legitimacy. They summon the past not to heal, but to justify the undoing of post-war arrangements. And in doing so, they awaken old ghosts. Minority populations become pawns. Propaganda revives ancient wounds. Alliances shift not because of present danger, but because of remembered betrayal. The past, once buried under treaties and trade deals, rises again, not as memory, but as motive. This is how wars begin, not always with immediate threats, but with slow-burning grievances. With speeches that invoke ancient borders. With textbooks rewritten to cast neighbors as historical enemies. With monuments restored not for beauty, but for symbolism. And in a world increasingly fragmented by nationalism, where trust is thin and social media amplifies every insult, the danger is not that someone will plan a great war, but that it will stumble into being, carried forward by a rising tide of resentment dressed in the robes of empire. The shadow of empire is long. And if we are not careful, we may walk straight into it, convinced that we are marching forward, when in fact, we are circling back to a place we once swore never to return. Part 4, The Fault Lines of the Modern World. Beneath the polished surface of modern diplomacy, where leaders shake hands and flags flutter in the breeze, the world is cracked with invisible fault lines. These are not always places of active war, but of tension, where opposing forces press quietly against one another, waiting for a slip. Like tectonic plates, these political and ideological divisions build pressure over time. And when they shift, the result can be sudden, violent, and far-reaching. To look at a map today is to see more than nations and borders. It's to glimpse the scars of history, the lines where empires once met, where cultures diverged, where ideologies collided and never quite settled. Along these borders, conflicts don't always need a cause, they just need an excuse. A border skirmish, a protest, a downed aircraft. the spark is almost irrelevant when the air is already thick with fuel. In Eastern Europe, the line between NATO and Russia's influence feels like a frozen front. Countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania exist both as sovereign states and as symbolic markers of a deeper rivalry. Poland, once divided and scarred by past wars, now watches its skies with a wary eye. And Ukraine, bleeding from an ongoing struggle, has become a tragic theater for a larger, colder conflict, a proxy not just of geopolitics, but of competing visions for how the world should be ordered. In Asia, the Taiwan Strait shimmers like a blade's edge. To many, the island represents the heart of democratic identity and self-determination. To others, it is an unfinished chapter of civil war, a missing piece of the motherland. Around it, fleets circle and drills are conducted, each one louder than the last. Across the South China Sea, coral reefs become strategic flashpoints, contested by maps, claimed by history, and fortified by concrete. Here, diplomacy is a dance performed over a minefield. The Middle East remains stitched together by treaties and old ambitions, but it is still volatile, still pulsing with the memory of crusades and colonialism, of revolutions and failed peace. Iran and Israel shadowbox across deserts and cyberspace. Syria remains fragmented, a mirror cracked beyond easy repair. And the Gulf, rich in oil and ambition, holds the potential for both progress and provocation. Africa, often overlooked in these global calculations, bears its own lines of tension, less about great power conflict and more about fragile borders drawn without regard for tribal or cultural coherence. Here, instability is chronic, often fueled by external interests cloaked in aid or investment. And yet, what begins in one region can ripple across oceans, especially in a world as interconnected as ours. Even the Arctic, once seen as the domain of polar bears and melting glaciers, has become a chessboard. As ice recedes, new sea routes emerge. New opportunities for resource extraction. And with them, new claims, military, territorial, ideological. It is perhaps the quietest of fault lines now, but also one of the most ominous. For where new ground is found, old ambitions tend to follow. What makes these fault lines so dangerous is not that they are unknown, it is that they are known too well. Everyone sees them. Everyone plans around them. And yet, they persist. No one wants war, but no one wants to yield either. Pride in politics harden positions. Nationalism turns flexibility into weakness. Each side waits for the other to blink. And in the waiting, the risk grows. Technology accelerates this risk. Missiles can now travel at hypersonic speeds. Satellites watch every move. Drones can strike without warning. In such a world, the window for second thoughts grows smaller. Miscommunication can become catastrophe. A false alarm can spiral into retaliation. And the more advanced we become, the more primitive the impulse to dominate becomes. The fault lines of the modern world are not only physical, they are emotional, cultural, and psychological. They run through memory, through pride, through fear. They remind us that peace is not the absence of war, but the presence of balance. And balance is always temporary. Always fragile. So as we look around our world today, at headlines and hotspots, at summits and sanctions, we must ask ourselves not if war is likely, but if we are truly prepared to recognize the fault lines before they crack. Because history has never been kind to those who pretend the ground beneath them is solid, when it is already starting to tremble. Part 5, The Return of the Arms Race. There was a time, not long ago, when the very phrase arms race seemed like an echo from a distant past, a Cold War relic, locked away with grainy film reels of mushroom clouds and duck-and-cover drills. But history, like nature, rarely stays quiet for long. The machinery of preparation, the calculus of deterrence, and the silent buildup of weapons have begun again, less visible this time, but no less ominous. The arms race has returned, though it wears a new face. Gone are the days when the fear of nuclear annihilation alone governed the logic of military expansion. Today, the contest is waged in broader dimensions, in cybernetic realms, in low-orbit satellites, in laboratories experimenting with artificial intelligence. And yet, the old fears linger, tethered to newer technologies. Once again, nations are counting missiles, adjusting doctrines, and watching each other with algorithms sharper than the human eye. In Russia, the ghost of military grandeur has been revived through hypersonic weapons and next-generation warheads. Their names, Avangard, Sarmat, sound like whispers from science fiction, but they are real, and they are fast. These are missiles designed not just to strike but to outmaneuver defense systems, to render shields obsolete before they are even tested. The message is not subtle: we are strong again, and we can reach you. Across the Pacific, China accelerates its modernization at a breathtaking pace. Where once the People's Liberation Army lagged in technology, now it innovates. Stealth fighters roll off production lines, aircraft carriers glide into the sea, and nuclear silos quietly multiply in the desert. But the race is not merely one of quantity, it is a race for technological supremacy, for control over the next battlefield, be it virtual or orbital. The United States, long the dominant military power, finds itself pressed from both sides. Its response is as old as empires and as modern as microchips: reinvest, rearm, and reimagine. Defense budgets swell. Space Force becomes more than a political punchline. Silicon Valley's algorithms find their way into Pentagon strategies. Old alliances are recalibrated. War games are played in cyberspace. And the question no one says aloud becomes louder: if we are preparing so much for war, are we also preparing for peace? Nations that once stood on the periphery are now stepping into the fray. India and Pakistan, long locked in their own perilous rivalry, expand their arsenals with quiet determination. North Korea continues its provocations with missile tests launched into dark skies. Iran plays a patient game, enriching uranium while negotiating from a position of simmering strength. Even Europe, after decades of relative calm, is beginning to reconsider its posture, its stockpiles, its sense of security. But perhaps the most dangerous aspect of this new arms race is its subtlety. The buildup is not always dramatic. It happens in increments, in budget increases, in prototype unveilings, in new policy white papers filled with strategic ambiguity. The public sees only glimpses. A test here. A joint drill there. The noise is low, the hum consistent. And yet, it is the same pattern that history has shown before. Preparation, followed by provocation. Readiness mistaken for aggression. Defense mistaken for offense. There is also the question of control. In the old days, there were hotlines and treaties, back channels and summits. The Cuban Missile Crisis was terrifying, but it was also a reminder that dialogue could halt disaster. Today, with more actors and more technologies, the lines are blurrier. Drones can be hacked. Satellites can be blinded. Artificial intelligence may one day decide who is a threat faster than a human can say stop. The arms race, in this era, is not always about firepower, it's about speed. Who can respond faster? Who can strike first? Who can survive second? And in that race, mistakes matter more than ever. A misread radar signal. A deepfake video. A cyber attack misattributed. These are not just theoretical risks. They are the new triggers of an old outcome. And so, the world spins forward, with vaults filling in generals planning, while ordinary people sleep beneath skies increasingly filled with silent, circling machines. The arms race is back. It never really left. It only changed its shape. And in that shape, we must ask again, can preparation for peace look so much like preparation for war? Part 6, Cyber Frontiers and Digital Wars. It begins with a flicker. A screen going dark. A line of code misplaced, or perhaps perfectly placed. Somewhere in a windowless room, fingers move across a keyboard not to create, but to infiltrate, to disable, to control. This is not the battlefield of tanks or trenches. It is quieter, colder. And yet, no less dangerous. It is the new frontier of war, cyberwarfare. In the past, when armies marched, they left behind the sound of boots and the dust of movement. Cities prepared by digging trenches or stocking shelters. Today, the conflict comes unseen. Power grids can vanish into blackout with a single digital strike. Hospital records can be locked behind silent ransom demands. Satellites that guide planes and ships can be nudged off course, invisible hands tilting the balance of war and peace. Every modern state now carries this invisible vulnerability, like a thread wound through its very infrastructure. In the United States, entire systems, from nuclear command networks to election databases, are guarded not just by soldiers but by firewalls and lines of code. Across the Pacific, China's Great Firewall not only censors but defends, shielding its internal order from external probes. Russia's cyber units operate in a gray zone, disrupting, leaking, destabilizing. And smaller states, from Iran to North Korea, have learned that digital chaos is cheap, but effective. It is not just governments that are targeted. Corporations now find themselves at the heart of geopolitical battles. A pipeline company. A social media platform. A chip manufacturer. What once required bombs now requires only access. And access, in the modern world, is everywhere. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of cyberwarfare is its ambiguity. A missile leaves a signature. A tank rolls across a border. But a hack? A digital fingerprint can be disguised, rerouted, hidden. Attribution becomes a matter of debate, not certainty. One nation accuses. Another denies. And in the space between, mistrust grows, alliances strain, and retaliation becomes a gamble. The cyber domain also challenges the rules of engagement. In traditional warfare, there are red lines, targets not to be struck, civilians to be spared, treaties to be followed. But who decides the rules in cyberspace? When a virus jumps from one server to another, when a firewall failure leads to hospital shutdowns, when information is stolen and twisted into disinformation, where's the line between espionage and active war? Artificial intelligence only deepens this complexity. Algorithms now scan for vulnerabilities faster than any human could. Machine learning predicts responses, adjusts attacks, fakes identities. Deepfakes, audio and video generated to mimic reality, can sow panic, spark conflict, shift elections. And as machines increasingly take over the decisions once made by generals and diplomats, we are left with a question we may not be ready to answer: what happens when war no longer needs us to begin? The psychological battlefield is equally real. Information is weaponized not to destroy cities, but to fracture societies. Online bots flood networks with division. Fake news blurs into real fear. Trust erodes, not only in governments but in neighbors, friends, even the self. The modern cyberwar doesn't just aim to crash systems. It aims to break confidence. And in doing so, it softens a society for more than just digital conquest. The most chilling truth? Many wars may already have begun. Not with explosions, but with eroded trust. Not with invasions, but with silent incursions. The infrastructure of our world, financial systems, supply chains, communications, all rely on invisible threads. And those threads are being tugged, tested, and sometimes cut. Cyberwarfare, in its silence, asks for constant vigilance. It demands a new kind of soldier, a new kind of defense. But it also requires something older: diplomacy, restraint, and a shared understanding of how fragile the digital world truly is. Because unlike cities that can be rebuilt or troops that can retreat, a society that loses trust may never fully recover. As we drift deeper into the age of interconnected systems and artificial thought, we must ask, will the next great war be fought not in the skies or seas, but inside the code that binds our lives together? And if it comes, will we even know it's begun? Part 7: Economic Fault Lines and Trade Wars. There was a time when wars were fought for territory, for borders drawn on dusty maps. But now, more often, the battlefield lies in markets and supply chains, in tariffs and embargoes, in the unspoken language of economic dominance. It begins not with troops amassing on a frontier, but with a sudden shift in currency, a subtle reshaping of trade routes, or rare earth metal held back in a warehouse half a world away. This is the war of capital, not of guns and steel, but of interest rates and scarcity. In the delicate machinery of global trade, every cog matters. A single shipping lane, blocked, delayed, politicized, can ripple through economies like tremors from a distant quake. When the world watched the Suez Canal grind to a halt in 2021, it wasn't just a ship that got stuck, it was a symbol of how tightly wound our economies truly are. And yet, that vulnerability hasn't bred caution. Instead, it has become a weapon in itself. Nations now wield their economies like cudgels, striking not at armies but at access. Sanctions become siege engines. Tariffs become border walls. Investment flows can be redirected like rivers, nourishing one region while starving another. The United States tightens its grip on advanced semiconductors, hoping to slow China's rise. China, in turn, controls the flow of critical minerals essential to green technologies and defense systems. The result is not a clean break, but a slow decoupling, a global divorce, economic and strategic, that leaves no side untouched. But economic warfare is not limited to giants. Smaller nations, too, find themselves entangled in webs of dependence and debt. Loans come with quiet conditions. Infrastructure projects arrive with invisible strings. Influence is bought not in votes or speeches, but in ports, pipelines, and power plants. And as alliances shift and economies intertwine, the risk grows, not of sudden collapse, but of silent leverage being pulled at the worst possible moment. Trade wars, unlike their kinetic counterparts, do not end with a treaty. They simmer. They fester. A tit-for-tat tariff can escalate slowly, almost imperceptibly, until entire industries are reshaped. Domestic jobs vanish. Prices rise. Nationalism grows teeth. And when economic anxiety swells within borders, it becomes fuel, ready to be ignited by a spark, a narrative, a single voice promising protection from foreign threat. In the modern world, power no longer wears only the uniform of generals. It wears suits. It sits in boardrooms, central banks, and trade ministries. Decisions made in quiet policy circles can unsettle entire continents. A change in interest rates by a major central bank might push a fragile nation into recession. A new tax on exports can trigger food shortages half a globe away. The invisible currents of commerce bind us, but they also bind us to each other's failures. Technology only magnifies this tension. A chip shortage halts factories in multiple countries. A cyber attack on a financial system disrupts international lending. Cryptocurrencies blur the lines of sovereignty and challenge traditional control. Economic stability, once measured in slow-moving ledgers and trade reports, now feels precarious, subject to flash crashes, algorithmic trades, and social media rumors that can erase billions in moments. Yet perhaps the most sobering truth is this: economic warfare often precedes real warfare. When dialogue fails and pressure mounts, when nations feel cornered by the financial vice of others, desperation becomes policy. In the 1930s, a global depression set the stage for ideological extremism and total war. Today, echoes of that past murmur in inflation spikes, housing crises, and the widening chasm between rich and poor. And so we must ask, if trust in trade erodes, if nations see competition not as rivalry but as threat, if the lifeblood of global commerce is weaponized, what comes next? Not every war is declared. Some are stumbled into, step by sanctioned step. Part 8, Proxy Wars and Distant Battlefields. Sometimes the world's fiercest battles aren't fought by those who start them. They unfold far from the capitals where decisions are made, in deserts and jungles, mountains and alleyways, places where power is filtered through other hands. Proxy wars, they are the shadow plays of empires, where great nations test one another's resolve using the lives of others. In these conflicts, war doesn't wear the uniform of regular armies. It emerges in local militias funded by foreign cash, in rebel movements armed by anonymous benefactors, in governments bolstered by shipments of weapons, advisors, and whispered intelligence. The battlefield shifts, not just in geography, but in clarity. Who is fighting for whom? Who holds the strings? These questions are not always answered, even by those pulling the trigger. From the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of Syria, From the hills of Afghanistan to the contested coasts of Yemen, the 20th and 21st centuries have been littered with wars where global giants used smaller stages to assert dominance. These were not cold skirmishes, they were hot, violent, and real for those caught within them. Civilians bore the brunt, infrastructures collapsed, and generations grew up knowing only conflict. Meanwhile, far-off powers analyzed maps, weighed risks, and adjusted their strategies with clinical detachment. But proxy wars are not merely tools of convenience. They are gambles. Each one risks spiraling out of control, pulling in more players, drawing lines that cannot be easily erased. What begins as a cautious test of what can become a firestorm of escalation. One side increases support, the other responds in kind, and soon the battlefield becomes a proving ground for weapons, doctrines, and ideologies. And beneath it all lies the dangerous assumption that this war, unlike the last, can be contained. Yet history tells a different story. In Afghanistan, foreign involvement across decades turned a local struggle into a crucible of Cold War tensions and post-9/11 ambitions. In Syria, overlapping proxy interests created a labyrinth where no side held a monopoly on violence or vision. And in Ukraine, we see perhaps the most sobering recent example, a war that began with one country's ambitions but swiftly drew in a world of military aid, economic sanctions, and existential posturing between nuclear powers. Today, new flashpoints simmer. In Africa, where minerals critical to global industry lie buried beneath fragile governments. In Taiwan, whose status touches the deepest nerves of superpower rivalry. In the Middle East, where ideologies and oil continue to entangle local disputes with global consequences. These aren't hypothetical war zones, they are already woven into the strategies of nations thousands of miles away. Proxy wars have evolved, too. They now unfold not just in physical terrain but in digital space. Hackers aligned with state interests disrupt power grids, leak classified information, manipulate public opinion. Information becomes a weapon, and truth a casualty. The new battlefield might be a city under siege, or a trending hashtag, a viral video, a doctored speech designed to inflame and divide. But behind each skirmish lies a deeper danger. Proxy wars allow nations to fight without appearing to. They create the illusion of distance, of insulation. But this very distance breeds complacency. If you're not the one sending troops, if your cities are not burning, it's easier to believe the war is under control. That belief can be fatal. For it only takes one miscalculation, one strike too many, one proxy who goes too far, one retaliation interpreted as a declaration, to turn a distant war into a global one. The mechanisms of restraint fray. Communications break down. And what was once a chessboard becomes a battlefield of kings. Proxy wars are the rehearsal halls of larger disasters. They are the embers that, if ignored, can ignite a forest. And in our age of instant response and global interconnection, the time between spark and blaze may be shorter than we think. Part 9, The Fragility of Alliances. Beneath the surface of every alliance lies a simple truth: unity is not static. It must be maintained, nourished, recalibrated. And even the most ironclad partnerships, those sealed with treaties, tested in wars, and reaffirmed by decades of diplomacy, can fray under pressure. As the world grows more unpredictable, so too do the bonds that once anchored it. The story of alliances is often told in banners and speeches, in handshakes before cameras and headlines that proclaim solidarity. But real alliances are not just formed in moments of triumph, they are tested in moments of fear, fatigue, and divergence. When economies strain, when elections shift national moods, when one ally grows weary of another's burdens or ambitions, the threat of cooperation becomes vulnerable. And in that moment, the illusion of collective strength can give way to quiet disunity. Consider NATO, once forged in the crucible of post-war Europe to contain Soviet expansion. For decades it stood as a pillar of deterrence and mutual defense. Yet today, beneath the surface, tensions linger. Some members invest less in defense than others, leaving frustrations to brew. Others pursue foreign policies that stray from the alliance's common values. As new threats emerge, from cyber attacks to political interference, the old definitions of defense and solidarity are tested. What counts as an attack? Who responds, and how swiftly? The answers are no longer clear. The same fragility exists in other corners of the world. In Asia, alliances stretch across the Pacific like a spider's web: the US and Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia. These partnerships deter, but they also depend on trust and timing. The specter of conflict in the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea looms large, and questions arise: would allies respond? Could they? Would they risk it all for promises made long ago, when the stakes felt more theoretical than they do now? Alliances are built on shared interests, but interests evolve. The world is no longer neatly divided into two ideologies. Nations that once aligned without question now hedge their bets, forging trade with one side while buying arms from another. The idea of non-alignment is gaining quiet traction, not as a moral stance, but as a survival strategy. In a world of great power rivalry, being beholden to none can be a form of freedom. And then there is the human element. Alliances are not just documents, they are shaped by people: presidents, prime ministers, ministers of defense, military commanders. A change in leadership can shift a country's stance overnight. One populist election, one abrupt policy reversal, and yesterday's partner becomes today's question mark. Trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild, especially when timelines are measured not in years, but in minutes: missile ranges, cyber infiltrations, economic shocks. When a world order depends on the strength of its alliances, their erosion is not just a diplomatic concern, it is a strategic vulnerability. Rivals watch closely. They test the edges. They look for signs of hesitation, of fractures behind the unity. And if those signs are there, if allies delay, disagree, or disavow, they may be emboldened. In past wars, the failure of alliances has triggered catastrophe. The tangled commitments of 1914 turned a regional assassination into a global war. In 1939, hesitation to confront early aggression encouraged further conquest. History whispers warnings, but it does not dictate the future. That is left to the choices of today. In times of calm, alliances are celebrated. In times of crisis, they are interrogated. What will they be in the next great trial? The answer lies not just in treaties and summits, but in the quiet choices of each nation, how they interpret their role, how they weigh risk, and whether they still believe that the defense of one is the defense of all. Because in the fog of war, hesitation can be as loud as defiance. And when alliances falter, the path to peace becomes lonelier, narrower, and infinitely more dangerous. Part 10: The Role of Emerging Powers. In a world so often shaped by the old giants, the United States, Russia, China, it is easy to overlook the quiet weight of emerging powers. They do not always shout, but they are moving. Rising economies, regional influencers, and ambitious states that straddle the line between old hierarchies and new aspirations, these are the nations that may not ignite the next global conflict, but could shape how, where, and whether it spreads. Emerging powers are not defined by GDP alone. They are measured in confidence, in reach, and in their willingness to act when others hesitate. Countries like India, Brazil, Turkey, Indonesia, and South Africa are stepping into roles once reserved for the great powers. Some wield growing technological capabilities, others serve as regional peacekeepers, disruptors, or voices for the underrepresented on the global stage. India, for instance, walks a delicate line. It shares tense borders with China, a deepening defense partnership with the West, and a long-standing tradition of strategic autonomy. In times of tension, it rarely chooses sides hastily, but its choices, when made, ripple far. If conflict breaks out across Asia or the Middle East, India's stance could tip the balance, influence global supply chains, or define the diplomatic tone of the global South. Turkey, bridging Europe and Asia, has become a master of playing both sides. A NATO member, yet increasingly independent in its military and energy policies. Its role in Syria, its handling of refugee flows, and its ambitions in Central Asia show a country unwilling to be a silent partner. Its decisions, at times unpredictable, carry consequences far beyond its borders. Brazil and South Africa, too, operate on a quieter frequency, less overtly military, more rooted in diplomacy, trade, and soft power. But in a multipolar world, influence is not just about firepower. It is about legitimacy, about being seen as a voice of reason when the major powers lose credibility. As global institutions strain under the weight of mistrust, these countries may emerge as mediators, conveners, or creators of new regional alignments. And then there are the wildcards, states that do not fit neatly into Western or Eastern blocs, but have ambitions that cannot be ignored. Iran, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, and others are not emerging in the traditional sense, but they are evolving. Iran expands its influence through proxy networks across the Middle East. North Korea threatens with nuclear bluster but operates within a complex web of deterrence and diplomacy. Saudi Arabia courts global tech and investment while recalibrating its regional role. What makes emerging powers so pivotal is not just what they do, but what they choose not to do. In a crisis, their silence may speak volumes. Their abstention at the UN, their refusal to endorse sanctions, their quiet outreach behind closed doors, these are not passive acts. They are statements of intent, of sovereignty. In a future war, emerging powers may act as pressure valves, mediators, or opportunists. Some may exploit chaos to strengthen their borders or economies. Others may try to prevent escalation, fearing what they've worked so hard to build could be swept away. The unpredictability lies not in their capabilities, but in their context, their domestic politics, their economic dependencies, their histories of colonization, resistance, and non-alignment. As the traditional giants edge toward confrontation, the world's fate may rest not only in their hands, but in the choices of those who orbit just outside their gravity. The emerging powers are no longer bystanders. They are pieces on the board, some small, some newly sharpened, all capable of shaping the endgame. In a conflict where no one wins, their greatest power may be the ability to prevent it from starting. But prevention requires will. And will, like peace, is never guaranteed. Part 11, the Cyber Frontier. Not all wars are fought with bullets, nor do all front lines lie on maps. In the quiet hum of data centers and the unseen flow of digital currents, a new battleground has emerged, vast, borderless, and always awake. This is the cyber frontier, where wars are waged not by tanks, but by code, not by generals, but by hackers. It is a realm that never sleeps, where nations jostle for dominance in shadows, and where the first blow of World War III may arrive not with an explosion, but with a silence. When the lights go out, the networks fail, and no one knows who struck first. Unlike traditional warfare, cyber conflict does not announce itself. It creeps in through back doors, worms through systems, waits patiently in the circuitry of banks, power grids, satellites, hospitals. It is asymmetric by nature, favoring the small, the clever, the desperate. A superpower with billions in defense spending can be humbled by a few lines of malicious code from a rogue group in a distant basement. Attribution is slippery. Retaliation is risk. And trust, the fragile glue of modern life, is its first casualty. In this invisible domain, every major power is both predator and prey. The United States, long at the forefront of cyber capability, has also borne the brunt of its vulnerabilities. Massive breaches of government data, ransomware attacks on infrastructure, and disinformation campaigns have exposed the fragility behind the digital curtain. China and Russia, too, operate cyber units with precision and ambition, probing weaknesses, testing responses, mapping the pressure points of their rivals. But it's not just states. Non-state actors, hacktivists, criminal syndicates, cyber mercenaries, swim these waters too. Some are ideological. Some are mercenary. Some are simply chaotic. And in a future war, they could serve as the loose matches scattered near powder kegs, unpredictable and uncontrollable once ignited. Cyber conflict is already reshaping how wars begin and how peace is maintained. A blackout in a major city. A sudden stock market plunge. A hospital network held hostage. These are not speculative fears, they have happened, in isolated incidents. But strung together, in times of high tension, they could become the dominoes that fall too quickly for diplomacy to catch. Imagine, then, a moment in the near future, rising tensions in the South China Sea, a disputed border flare up, accusations fly. One side's communications go dark. Missiles haven't been fired, but the fear is already thick. Who attacked the network? Was it a warning shot, or a prelude? The fog of war thickens, not on the battlefield, but in data logs and security briefings. Panic grows. The old rules of deterrence, the ones built on visibility, accountability, thresholds, do not apply here. And therein lies the danger. The cyber frontier lacks clear boundaries, treaties, and norms. In the nuclear age, humanity learned to fear and manage mutual destruction. But in the digital age, the weapons are cloaked, the consequences delayed, the responses confused. There is no equivalent of a missile silo, no visible deterrent to hold back a nervous trigger finger. Some efforts have been made. International agreements, cyber norms, digital Geneva conventions. But enforcement is weak, and trust even weaker. Too many actors, too many incentives to cheat, too many opportunities to act with plausible deniability. And yet, despite the risks, no global war has yet begun in cyberspace. Perhaps because the powers that roam here understand its volatility. Or perhaps because they are still testing, still mapping the edges. But each passing year, each attack that goes unanswered or each retaliation that escalates beyond control, brings us closer to the edge. In this domain, the line between war and peace is always blurred. The cyber frontier is not just a battlefield, it is the nervous system of civilization. And in the next global conflict, it may not decide who fires the first shot. It may decide whether the world survives it at all. Part 12, the AI Arms Race. There was a time when intelligence meant generals hunched over maps, analysts poring over intercepted communications, and scouts on horseback reporting back with news from the front. Today, the scouts do not breathe. The analysts do not sleep. And the generals? They're being outpaced by machines capable of parsing millions of data points in seconds. Welcome to the AI arms race, a race not of missiles, but of minds coded into silicon and trained on the past to predict the future. Artificial intelligence has transformed how nations perceive threat and power. From unmanned drones that can loiter over battlefields for hours to language models that can generate propaganda, AI is not merely a tool, it's a battlefield multiplier, a force that blurs the boundaries between information, weapon, and strategy. Every algorithm is a decision maker, and the decisions it makes, sometimes autonomously, can mean life or death. What makes this race so perilous is not just the speed at which it evolves, but the opacity of its inner workings. Even its creators sometimes do not understand why an AI behaves the way it does. In war, where clarity and control are essential, a system that cannot be predicted, or that misinterprets intent, can be catastrophic. Imagine an AI system designed to detect incoming attacks misreading a military exercise as an imminent strike. The response may be immediate, automated, and irreversible. Across the globe, major powers are investing billions into AI research, not just for economic advancement, but for military supremacy. The United States seeks to maintain its technological edge, fearing that ceding ground to others would invite vulnerability. China envisions AI as central to its goal of becoming a global superpower, embedding it deeply into its surveillance networks, command systems, and automated defenses. Russia, while lacking the economic scale, compensates with asymmetrical applications, deploying AI in cyberwarfare and disinformation, mastering chaos rather than control. But it's not just nation-states. Private corporations and shadowy contractors now hold the keys to advanced models. The lines between military and civilian tech are fading, and in times of crisis, the algorithms developed for market predictions or language translation can be repurposed for war. AI models trained to detect patterns in stock behavior may soon be used to predict enemy movements, or to create them where none exist. Autonomous weapons, too, are no longer the stuff of science fiction. Loitering munitions, drone swarms, and precision strikes guided by machine learning are already in testing, and in some cases, in use. They don't feel hesitation. They don't require sleep. They don't ask questions. And the temptation to deploy them preemptively, especially when human decision-making is too slow, is growing with each technological breakthrough. The international community has tried to respond. Proposals for AI weapon bans. Ethical frameworks. Summits. But regulation lags far behind innovation, and trust remains elusive. In an arms race where victory may depend on who lets the machines decide first, restraint becomes a liability, not a virtue. There's also the specter of disinformation, AI-generated images, videos, and even voices that are indistinguishable from reality. In a future crisis, how will leaders know if the video they see of a bombing is real or fabricated? How will soldiers know if the voice ordering them forward is their commander, or a synthetic mimic? Truth, once the anchor of diplomacy and deterrence, is now fluid, malleable, and weaponized. Yet amidst the fear, there is also potential. AI can assist in diplomacy, simulate outcomes, prevent miscalculations. It can monitor borders, detect cyber attacks before they spread, and translate across languages in real time. Like fire, it can warm or destroy. And like fire, once unleashed, it cannot be recalled. In the coming years, the AI arms race may not be won by the nation with the most data, or the fastest processors. It may be decided by who can integrate these systems without losing control of them. By who understands that artificial intelligence, for all its promise, cannot replace human judgment, but can rapidly magnify its absence. If there is to be a World War III, it may be shaped not by ideology or land, but by code written in quiet labs, unleashed into a world unprepared for the speed, scale, and silence of machines at war. Part 13, Proxy Wars in the Modern Age. In a world where nuclear weapons sleep beneath layers of protocol and deterrence, open war between superpowers has become a fearful relic, too dangerous, too final, too unwinnable. But wars have not ceased. They have simply changed their shape. The great powers, wary of direct confrontation, have taken to shadowboxing, fighting not in their own lands or names, but through others. These are the proxy wars, where distant lands become theaters, and local soldiers become pawns in global games. Modern proxy wars are less about conquest and more about influence, ideological, strategic, economic. They erupt in places where institutions are fragile, where old grievances simmer, and where global interests collide. And they burn long and low, like coals beneath ash, sometimes flaring into open violence, sometimes simmering unnoticed by the world. The Middle East remains one of the clearest mirrors of this phenomenon. In Syria, a civil uprising spiraled into a tangled web of foreign interventions. Russia flew bombers in support of Assad's regime. The United States armed rebels. Iran funneled troops and resources. Turkey watched nervously and struck when it pleased. Each nation claimed different enemies. But in truth, they all fought to stake their claims, to prevent rivals from gaining ground in a region where power is measured not just in land, but in loyalty. Yemen offers another reflection of this strategy. On the surface, it is a war between a government and insurgents. Beneath that, it is a chessboard where Saudi Arabia and Iran test each other's reach, supplying arms, shaping factions, and dragging a poor nation deeper into humanitarian crisis. The people bleed, while the sponsors plot. Ukraine, too, began with masked men in unmarked uniforms, a conflict where the aggressor denied its own presence until the lines hardened and denial gave way to declarations. Russia's early moves in Donbass and Crimea echoed Cold War tactics: destabilize, divide, and deny. And while the war has since escalated into something far more direct, its roots were firmly planted in the strategies of indirect control. In Africa, in the shadows of deserts and jungles, another chapter unfolds. Here, proxy conflict is not just about governments but about resources: gold, oil, rare earth minerals. Foreign powers, including China, Russia, and the West, pour money, mercenaries, and machinery into regions whose instability offers both risk and reward. The soldiers on the ground often know little of the global stakes their lives have been bartered for. But proxy wars are not always fought with bullets. Some are waged with ideology. The Cold War saw this clearly, America and the Soviet Union propping up governments, fueling coups, and guiding revolutions not for the good of those nations, but for the symbolic triumph of capitalism or communism. That playbook is not discarded, it's merely updated. Today's proxies might be internet influencers, political parties, or hacking collectives, armed not with rifles, but with memes and malware. What makes proxy wars so dangerous in the 21st century is not just their persistence, but their unpredictability. They blur the line between local and global, between civil unrest and international escalation. A drone strike in Libya may trigger a diplomatic rupture in Europe. A malicious victory in Sudan may shift naval strategies in the Red Sea. No war is truly isolated anymore, because every theater echoes across a connected world. And as technologies advance, cheap drones, cyber weapons, disinformation bots, the cost of waging war by proxy becomes lower, more tempting. Nations no longer need to invade when they can destabilize. No need for flags when deniability suffices. The battlefield is the world, and the battle is often quiet. Yet behind every proxy war are people, families torn, cities shelled, generations scarred. The strategic benefits for distant capitals are bought with real blood in forgotten villages. The cruelty of proxy conflict lies not only in its efficiency, but in its cowardice. Those who plan often do not suffer. Those who suffer rarely understand why. As the world tiptoes around the prospect of another great war, it is in these proxy fires that the temperature rises. Here, alliances are tested, ambitions revealed. Here, the fuse may be lit, not with the roar of tanks across borders, but with whispered deals and hidden hands moving pieces on a faraway board. If a third world war ever comes, its earliest chapters may not be recognized at first. They may already be written in the deserts of Syria, the mountains of Yemen, the fields of Donbass, or the code of a shadowy cyber attack. And by the time the world sees the war for what it is, it may already be far too late to call it anything else. Part 14. Climate stress and resource conflicts. The winds shift. The rains grow uncertain. The rivers dry and the sea rises. Slowly, quietly, the climate reshapes the world, not with sudden violence, but with creeping force. And beneath this planetary rearrangement, human tension grows. For in the wake of scarcity, of ruin, of fire and flood, comes desperation. And where desperation lingers, conflict is never far behind. In the arid stretches of the Sahel, entire communities teeter on the edge of viability. Pastoralists who once moved with the seasons now find nothing but dust. Farmers watch the soil crack beneath their feet. Cattle die. Crops fail. And people move, seeking food, water, and the chance to survive. But when they arrive, they often find others already there, clinging to the same fragile resources. The result is not always war, but often something close: tribal clashes, ethnic strife, insurgencies that rise from environmental despair. In South Asia, the Himalayas are melting. The glaciers, once eternal, are thinning year by year, feeding the great rivers of the Indus, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, lifelines for billions. What happens when the melt slows, when the flow falters, and two nuclear nations, India and Pakistan, both stare into an emptying well? Water, once a symbol of life, becomes a trigger for fear. And fear, when coupled with mistrust, leads to confrontation. In the Middle East, the Euphrates and Tigris, ancient rivers of Eden, now shrink beneath dam projects and prolonged droughts. Nations downstream suffer. Farmers abandon fields. Cities tighten their belts. Syria's collapse, some argue, was not just political, it was climatic. A brutal drought, coupled with weak governance, drove millions from countryside to city, tipping a fragile balance into chaos. Climate was not the match, perhaps, but it filled the room with fumes. Elsewhere, the Arctic melts, and nations rush north, not for ice, but for oil, gas, shipping lanes, and strategic footholds. The polar frontier becomes the next geopolitical contest, where submarines glide beneath thinning sheets and satellite eyes watch every maneuver. The world's coldest place grows hot with ambition. In the Pacific, rising seas swallow shorelines. Island nations consider relocation, entire cultures adrift. Will they become climate refugees? Stateless people? Or sparks in a growing debate over responsibility and sovereignty? Behind the diplomatic phrases lie deep truths, that those who suffer most from climate change often contributed least to it. And those who shaped the crisis may now be forced to answer for it, not only with aid, but perhaps with arms, as climate-driven migration becomes a point of contention. Climate stress does not create conflict from nothing. It amplifies what already exists: inequality, poor governance, ethnic fault lines, historical grievances. It is not a gun, but a trigger finger. And as weather patterns grow more erratic, it will press harder. The military minds of the world already speak in new terms: climate readiness, water security, disaster wargaming. Generals look not just at tanks and jets, but at temperature maps and flood forecasts. Defense is no longer just about borders, it's about infrastructure resilience, food chains, power grids under storm threat. The battlefield now includes forests, glaciers, and coastlines. But climate conflict is often invisible until it erupts. There is no clear villain, no single event. It is a long pressure, a slow boil. Leaders ignore it because it doesn't explode, until, one day, it does. A port is closed. A river becomes a weapon. A migration stream turns into a humanitarian crisis and then into a border war. The climate does not take sides. It does not care who wins or loses. But its impact is uneven, and that unevenness fuels the very human tendency to fight over what remains. Oil, water, food, land, none of it infinite. And in a warming world, every resource becomes a battlefield in waiting. In this way, climate change may not start World War III. But it may guide us to its gates, hand in hand with all the old causes: fear, power, pride. It is the silent accelerant, the invisible general, the storm behind the strategy. And as the earth turns warmer still, the question lingers not in policy papers or conferences, but in dry riverbeds, in salt-choked fields, in the eyes of those walking away from homes now too hot to hold. The question is not if climate will drive conflict, but when, and where, and who will burn first. Part 15, The Fragility of Alliances. The map is not just a geography of land, it is a web of promises. Lines drawn not by rivers or mountains, but by treaties, handshakes, and secret protocols. The world, for decades, has relied on this invisible fabric of alliances to keep order, to promise retaliation, to deter ambition. But webs, however carefully spun, are delicate. And in the cold calculus of geopolitics, trust wears thin faster than anyone dares admit. In the long shadow of the Second World War, the great alliances were born: NATO, the cornerstone of Western security; the Warsaw Pact, long dissolved but never forgotten; defense treaties binding nations across oceans and continents. These alliances, forged in the heat of history, were designed to hold back chaos. They made clear, an attack on one would be an attack on all. But time does strange things to promises. Alliances rely not only on military capability, but on perception, on belief that your partner will come when called. And belief is a fragile thing. It falters under political change, under shifting priorities, under the slow drift of national interest. The loudest voice in the room can change with an election. What was once steadfast becomes uncertain. In boardrooms and barracks across the world, planners ask not just what alliances exist, but whether they still mean what they once did. America, long the fulcrum of many alliances, now sends mixed messages. Some allies worry: will the United States bleed for distant lands, or turn inward under the weight of its own divisions? Others question their own readiness: have they grown too reliant on promises they can no longer defend alone? In Europe, cracks appear. NATO stands, but its cohesion is tested. Some members doubt the will of others. Defense budgets lag behind ambition. In moments of crisis, Crimea, Ukraine, the Baltics, the question is not just what Russia will do, but how firmly the alliance will respond. Mutual defense becomes a theory in need of proof. In Asia, old partnerships face new challenges. The US-Japan alliance holds, but strains beneath regional uncertainty. South Korea watches the North and wonders not just about missiles, but about the future of U.S. commitment. Across the Pacific, defense pacts with Australia, the Philippines, and others remain, but the rise of China changes the calculation. Balance becomes tension. Cooperation, a cautious dance. Even within regional blocs, cohesion wavers. The European Union, bound by more than military agreements, must contend with internal fractures, economic disparities, immigration debates, nationalist surges. Solidarity, once assumed, now feels like something that must be constantly negotiated. And beyond the West, new alignments take shape. Russia and China draw closer, not through shared values but shared interests. Iran, long isolated, finds partners in unexpected places. Turkey, a NATO member, walks a careful path between East and West. Alliances today are not fixed, they shift like sand beneath a tide. The danger is not that alliances fail all at once, but that they fray at the edges. That in the moment of need, a call for help is met with hesitation, with bureaucracy, with delay. That ambiguity becomes an invitation. Adversaries test resolve not through full invasion, but through incremental challenge. A cyber attack here. A provocation there. If the response is unclear, the damage is done, not in bombs, but in the erosion of deterrence. And yet, alliances also endure. They are not just military agreements, they are habits of cooperation, of intelligence sharing, of joint training and shared values. They adapt. They reform. But they are only as strong as the belief behind them. That belief must be renewed, not with speeches, but with actions. In a world growing more multipolar, more uncertain, alliances must walk a narrow road. They must reassure without provoking. Deter without escalating. Promise without overcommitting. And always, they must ask the question, who will truly stand when the silence is broken? The fragility of alliances is not their failure, but their dependence on trust. And trust, once lost, takes generations to rebuild. In the quiet spaces between headlines and summits, that trust is tested every day, in exercises, in diplomacy, in the slow grind of politics. The future may not be decided by new wars, but by old friendships, forgotten, misunderstood, or abandoned. And if the world ever stumbles into great conflict again, it may not be because the enemies were too strong, but because the allies were too uncertain. Part 16, Economic Fault Lines and Global Dependence. In the quiet hum of a shipping port, containers rise and fall like building blocks in the hands of giants. A coffee bean grown in Colombia finds its way to a cafe in Seoul. A chip designed in California powers a phone assembled in Shenzhen, sold in Nairobi, and used to call a loved one in Berlin. The world's economy, once a series of isolated islands, now pulses like a single, fragile organism. Interconnected. Dependent. Exposed. For decades, globalization was seen as the antidote to war. A world too entangled to unravel, too interlinked to fight itself. If nations traded, they would not wage war, so the logic went. But economic ties, like silk threads, can both connect and constrict. And when those threads are stretched too tightly, they snap in silence before anyone notices. Supply chains, once seen as efficient marvels, now appear as strategic vulnerabilities. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed just how delicately the system is balanced. A virus, invisible and indifferent, shut down factories, delayed shipments, emptied shelves. It reminded the world that prosperity rests not only on ingenuity, but on trust and stability, commodities growing rarer by the year. Now, beneath the surface of economic growth, tension builds. Nations hoard critical resources, rare earth minerals, semiconductors, grain, energy. The illusion of endless abundance falters in the face of rising nationalism and economic insecurity. Trade wars, tariffs, and sanctions become everyday tools, wielded not in backrooms, but on the world stage. In the quiet corridors of financial institutions, new anxieties take root. Inflation, debt, and inequality, problems once managed in cycles, now converge in ways that defy prediction. Developing nations struggle beneath the weight of global market swings they did not cause. Meanwhile, great powers weaponize access, energy as leverage, currency as punishment, market access as reward. The United States, long the anchor of the global financial order, finds its position both envied and resented. The dollar remains dominant, but whispers grow of alternative systems, of China's yuan-backed trade blocs, of digital currencies outside centralized control. The BRICS nations, once a loose collection of emerging markets, explore new financial alliances not to challenge the system, but to escape it. Energy, too, reveals a tangled web of dependencies. Europe, once reliant on Russian gas, now scrambles for alternatives in a shifting landscape. The Middle East, long a fulcrum of oil politics, watches as climate goals and green transitions threaten its economic foundations. And China, whose appetite powers entire continents, faces the question, how long can growth remain infinite in a finite world? These fault lines are not just economic, they are political. A semiconductor shortage halts car production, but it also shifts defense capabilities. A wheat shortage in one region sparks protests in another. When the arteries of commerce are blocked, the symptoms appear far from the source. And then there is the question of control. Who owns the ports? The data? The infrastructure that makes globalization possible? Investment flows, once seen as benign, now carry strategic weight. Railways in Africa, airports in Europe, telecom networks across Asia, all part of a new economic terrain where commerce and strategy blur. The danger lies not just in collapse, but in miscalculation. A financial shock in one country triggers a cascade. A sanction meant to punish instead unites adversaries. An embargo becomes an excuse for retaliation. Economic friction, once solved with negotiation, now threatens to harden into confrontation. Yet within this fragility is also opportunity. Economic dependence, while risky, also binds. The same thread that can strangle can also steady. Nations, even those in rivalry, rely on each other in ways that complicate easy aggression. The calculus of war is no longer measured solely in tanks and soldiers, but in currency stability, shipping lanes, and consumer confidence. In boardrooms and ministries alike, leaders face a paradox: how to reduce dependence without isolation, how to remain open without being vulnerable. It is a balance few have mastered. The world economy is not a fortress, it is a network, alive with movement and risk. And in that movement lies both the potential for peace and the seeds of discord. The challenge ahead is not just navigating the markets, but remembering that behind every transaction is trust. And when trust falters, the whole system begins to sway. Part 17, The Rise of Populism and Nationalist Sentiment. Across the world, in city squares and village cafes, in the swirling depths of online forums and on the lips of politicians with sharpened tongues, a new mood is taking hold. Or perhaps it is an old mood, reborn for the modern age. The language is familiar, even if the banners have changed, calls to reclaim, to restore, to defend what is ours. It is the voice of the people rising against what they perceive as distant elites, broken systems, and forgotten promises. Populism and nationalism, long buried beneath the post-war dream of a globalized liberal order, are no longer whispers at the fringes. They have become central forces, redefining elections, reshaping policies, and redrawing the boundaries of what nations believe themselves to be. At its heart, populism is not just a political strategy, it is a feeling. A sense that the world has tilted too far away from the average citizen. That decisions are made in glass towers by hands that never held soil, never felt hunger, never listened to the heartbeat of the common home. It pits us against them, the people against the establishment, the local against the foreign, the old ways against the rushing tide of change. In times of uncertainty, such a message is powerful. And our era, heavy with change, offers no shortage of fuel. The dislocations of global trade, the unease of cultural shifts, the scars left by financial crashes and pandemics, each becomes a wound that populists promise to heal. Their language is plain, their promises bold, their enemies clearly drawn. Nationalism walks alongside populism, its arm wrapped around a vision of the past. It is the belief that a nation's greatness lies in its purity, in its sovereignty, in the borders it builds both physically and emotionally. Flags are raised, anthems sung, and history is polished into myth. The idea of the nation becomes not just an administrative boundary, but a living thing, fragile, sacred, and under siege. From the Rust Belt towns of America to the rural heartlands of Europe, from South Asian strongholds to South American capitals, the rise of these sentiments is reshaping discourse. Multilateralism is viewed with suspicion. Immigration becomes a lightning rod. International agreements are renegotiated, sometimes torn apart. Walls, once symbols of division, are now campaign promises. And yet, the danger is not in patriotism itself. It is in the narrowing of vision. When the world is painted only in shades of us in them, nuance disappears. Dialogue becomes confrontation. Compromise is seen as weakness. In this climate, diplomacy grows brittle, and the machinery of peace, carefully built over generations, begins to rust from disuse. Populist leaders often rise quickly, carried on waves of frustration and fervor. They present themselves not as managers of the state, but as saviors from it. Institutions, once respected, are cast as corrupt or irrelevant. The press becomes the enemy. Checks and balances are rebranded as obstacles. Slowly, the guardrails of democracy are loosened, not with violence, but with applause. And when populism spreads across borders, it changes how nations see one another. Global summits become stages for grievance. Alliances, once stable, now tremble with mutual suspicion. Countries that once cooperated on shared goals now find themselves locked in ideological standoffs, each retreating into their own echo chambers. This is not merely a political shift, it is a psychological one. It alters how societies process fear, how they remember history, how they dream of the future. And in an age where the pace of change outstrips understanding, the appeal of simplicity, of certainty, is irresistible. But the world is not simple. It never was. And the challenges of our time, climate, technology, migration, inequality, do not respect borders or slogans. They demand collaboration, patience, and trust. Qualities that populism often devalues in its pursuit of quick victories and loud acclaim. The rise of populism and nationalism is not a signal of collapse, but it is a sign of tension. It reminds us that the global order rests not on treaties alone, but on the perceptions of millions. If people believe the system has failed them, they will not wait politely for it to change, they will demand it. And if that demand grows too loud, too unyielding, the delicate balance between nations may not hold. Not because war is planned, but because understanding is lost. In that silence, the world becomes more dangerous, not by accident, but by choice. Part 18, The Weaponization of Information. There was a time when wars were waged with spears and muskets, when lines were drawn in the dirt and battles were measured in bodies. But in this era, power flows through quieter channels. It moves along fiber optic cables, dances across screens, and hides within headlines. We live in an age where the most potent weapons do not explode, they persuade, distort, or divide. This is the age of information warfare, and the battlefield is everywhere. It begins with a message. Not a loud one, not even necessarily false. Sometimes it is just a whisper, a question here, a suspicion there, a grain of doubt placed gently where certainty once lived. A meme that mocks. A headline that inflames. A video clip ripped from its context and made to speak a lie. And from that seed, whole forests of confusion begin to grow. Governments have always used propaganda. But today's tools are sharper, faster, and far harder to trace. State-sponsored disinformation campaigns now operate through networks of fake accounts, influencers, and subtle algorithms. Nations no longer need to invade to undermine, they need only to mislead, to distract, to sow enough noise that truth itself becomes suspect. This is not limited to autocracies or far-flung cyber units. It is a global phenomenon. Election interference, coordinated misinformation, deepfake technology, and AI-generated narratives have turned trust into a rare and fragile thing. In a world awash with content, What matters is not what is true, but what spreads. And what spreads fastest is fear. Information is weaponized not only to mislead populations abroad but to fragment societies at home. Political polarization is no longer just a product of ideology, it is manufactured, encouraged, and amplified. Discourse becomes a minefield, disagreement becomes treason, and echo chambers replace civic squares. The ties that once bound communities are frayed by suspicion and sharpened by carefully stoked outrage. In this fog, institutions falter. The press, already weakened by economic pressures, finds itself accused from all sides, too biased, too slow, too elite. Scientists, judges, public servants, once guardians of reason, are pulled into partisan battles they never sought. Facts are no longer foundations. They are just one opinion among many, easily dismissed by the next viral post. Meanwhile, intelligence agencies and defense analysts no longer draw red lines on maps, they trace data trails. They study not just military movements, but meme networks, forum chatter, and the digital footprints of influencers. Strategic planning must now account for information attacks that erode morale, distort intentions, or ignite unrest without a single shot fired. The dangers are not only external. A society that cannot agree on what is real is a society vulnerable to implosion. If no source is trustworthy, then manipulation becomes effortless. If every truth has a counter-narrative, then justice becomes optional. The erosion is slow, but steady, like salt water eating away at the keel of a ship. The hull still gleams, but the voyage is no longer safe. Some nations have begun to respond. Cybersecurity has expanded to include disinformation defense. Media literacy programs seek to build resilience in young minds. Social platforms, under pressure, try to stem the flood. But the arms race is relentless. For every lie taken down, 1,000 more are born. The velocity of the digital age favors the fast, not the factual. And the implications for peace are profound. In a crisis, when communication matters most, a single falsified report can provoke panic. A hacked video can trigger retaliation. A misinterpreted statement, amplified by bots and bad actors, can spiral into confrontation. Wars have been started for less. We are not yet at the point where a tweet can launch missiles, but we are closer than we should be. The weaponization of information is not a distant threat, it is the air we breathe. It shapes elections, poisons dialogue, and prepares the ground for deeper fractures. In a world primed for mistrust, conflict does not need an architect. It only needs enough people who believe the worst. And so, the quiet war continues, not in trenches, but in timelines. Not with tanks, but with texts. A war where the casualty is truth itself. Part 19, The Danger of Miscalculation. In the long corridors of power, behind closed doors and secure phone lines, there exists a fear more pervasive than the enemy's strength. It is not the size of a rival's army or the range of their missiles, it is the simple, terrifying possibility of getting it wrong. Of misreading a signal. Of reacting to a shadow. Of letting fear masquerade as fact. For in the modern age, war may not come from intention, it may come from mistake. The world today is fast. Too fast, in many ways, for the kind of deliberation that once governed statecraft. Satellites track troop movements in real time. Submarines maneuver silently beneath contested waters. Fighter jets graze invisible lines in the sky. In such a world, a single action, a jet downed, a radar ping misread, a convoy in the wrong valley, can become a spark. History knows this danger well. In 1914, it was the assassination of an archduke that cascaded into World War I, not through grand plans, but through a series of poorly timed mobilizations and rigid alliances. In 1983, the world came within minutes of nuclear war when Soviet systems falsely detected an American missile launch, averted only by the quiet judgment of a lone officer who chose to wait. The threat is not only in what we do, but in what we think the other is doing. Today's nuclear command systems are faster, more complex, and spread across multiple platforms. Decision windows, once measured in hours, can now be reduced to mere minutes. The pressure to act swiftly, to not appear weak, to respond with strength, weighs heavily on leaders. But strength without clarity can become a trap. And in an era shaped by misinformation, deepfakes, and cyber interference, clarity is a vanishing resource. Imagine a crisis, a border skirmish between two nuclear powers. A missile misfires or is misidentified. A city goes dark due to a cyber attack, but no one knows who sent it. Social media erupts with speculation and fake videos. The press demands answers. A general warns that hesitation could cost lives. A president, isolated in a bunker, watches radar screens flicker. Is it an accident? A provocation? Or the beginning of something catastrophic? The wrong decision made in haste could unleash devastation not because anyone wanted war, but because no one could afford to look uncertain. The logic of deterrence, so central to modern peace, relies on signaling strength. But if both sides believe they must strike first to avoid destruction, then peace becomes a coin toss. There is also the human factor. Leaders are not algorithms. They are tired, pressured, sometimes misinformed. Intelligence can be flawed. Advisors can disagree. In the fog of tension, what seems like a deliberate escalation may be a misstep. What feels like a final warning may be interpreted as an attack. The history of conflict is littered with these tragic errors, moments when pride, confusion, or poor timing turn manageable tension into open war. Technology, for all its precision, does not eliminate this risk, it multiplies it. Artificial intelligence is now involved in early warning systems, threat detection, and targeting decisions. But AI does not feel doubt. It does not pause to question its assumptions. It calculates. And in the face of ambiguous data, it may choose to err on the side of survival. Which, in military logic, means to strike. The danger of miscalculation is not only between great powers. Regional conflicts, between India and Pakistan, North and South Korea, Iran and Israel, each carry their own hair-trigger risks. In these arenas, where past wounds run deep and trust is thin, even routine military exercises can be read as preparation for war. A drone crosses a border. A diplomat is assassinated. A base is bombed by mistake. The world watches. And holds its breath. What is frightening is not the presence of enemies, it is the absence of fail-safes. In a world wired to react, patience becomes radical. Restraint becomes revolutionary. But they are needed now more than ever. For in the nuclear age, there is no margin for error. There is no room for ego. There is only the hope that the next mistake is not the last. This is why the danger of miscalculation is so acute. It makes conflict not just a choice, but a possibility that hovers over every tension. A slip of the tongue, a misread radar, a hasty retaliation, it is in these narrow spaces that world wars have begun. And as the world grows more complex, the margin for misunderstanding grows thinner. Part 20, Civil Unrest as a Catalyst. A nation is not only the sum of its borders and armies. Beneath the flags and the speeches lies something far more volatile, the will of its people. When that will begins to fray, when voices rise not in unison but in anger, the very foundations of power begin to shake. And in those tremors, even distant wars can find a path home. Throughout history, the spark of civil unrest has often ignited far more than domestic upheaval. It has toppled kings and crumbled empires. It has opened the door to revolution and, just as often, to war. Not because the people willed it, but because instability at home can make nations reckless abroad. Or vulnerable. Or both. In the 1930s, it was economic despair and social fragmentation that gave rise to fascism in Europe, driving leaders to seek distraction and conquest in enemies in foreign lands. In the wake of the Arab Spring, protests fueled by hunger, inequality, and repression reshaped entire regions, leading to civil wars that spilled across borders and drew in global powers. And in recent years, from Paris to Minneapolis, from Santiago to Tehran, the streets have filled again. The slogans may differ. The causes may vary. But the underlying pulse is the same, something is broken. Civil unrest begins in silence. It grows in frustration. And then, like a sudden storm, it explodes. A price hike. A police shooting. An election that feels stolen. The crowd gathers. The chant echoes. The first stone is thrown. What happens next depends not on the crowd, but on those in charge. Do they listen? Or do they tighten their grip? When governments feel cornered by unrest, they may seek legitimacy through aggression. A manufactured crisis abroad can unify a fractured public, if only briefly. The drums of war can drown out the noise of dissent. The old enemy becomes new again. Flags wave. Voices are silenced. This is not new. It is one of history's oldest plays. But it can also move the other way. Domestic unrest can expose weakness, making a nation an inviting target for rivals. When a country's attention is turned inward, toward riots, impeachment, mass protests, it is less able to project strength abroad. Allies begin to doubt. Adversaries begin to calculate. And suddenly, the world grows more dangerous, not because of what a nation does, but because of what it no longer can. Civil unrest doesn't have to be widespread to matter. A trucker's strike. A teacher's walkout. A cyber attack that causes panic at a bank. These events reveal pressure points, weaknesses in supply chains, in emergency response, in leadership trust. And when those pressure points are exposed, they become vulnerable to exploitation. In the digital age, unrest can be kindled not by injustice alone, but by algorithm. Disinformation campaigns, seeded from abroad, can deepen divisions. Deepfake videos, forged documents, and synthetic outrage can turn neighbors into enemies. What was once a protest becomes a powder keg. And no one quite remembers how it began. Then there's the question of security. As unrest grows, so too does the militarization of public life. Police forces adopt the tools of soldiers. Surveillance expands. Civil liberties contract. This slow erosion of democratic norms is often justified by fear, and once that threshold is crossed, returning becomes harder. Internal peace becomes conditional. External aggression becomes easier. But perhaps most chilling is this: civil unrest is not always spontaneous. In a world where power is information, unrest can be engineered. A blackout in a major city. A leaked scandal timed to a vote. A rumor that spreads faster than fact. These moments, if carefully planned, can cripple a society more effectively than bombs. And when a nation falls into chaos, its allies may rush in. Its enemies may pounce. Its people, caught in the middle, may see the world change without a single shot fired in their name. Civil unrest is not just a domestic concern. It is a global tremor, felt across continents. When great nations convulse, the world holds its breath. Because history has taught us this, no war begins without a people first pushed to the edge. And no peace endures where voices are unheard. So when we ask whether another world war is possible, we must not only look to the generals or the presidents. We must also look to the streets. To the hunger. To the rage. To the quiet, rising murmur of a people tired of being ignored. For it is from such places, such moments, that history's most violent tides have often turned. Part 21, The Crisis of Leadership in a Fragmented World. In times of calm, leadership is a craft of vision. But in times of uncertainty, when borders blur, alliances fray, and truths grow slippery, it becomes a test of soul. The modern world, with its tangled economies and instant communication, has grown faster than the men and women tasked with guiding it. And in that gap, between what leaders must navigate and what they understand, lies one of the great vulnerabilities of our time. The 20th century knew giants, flawed, yes, but forceful. Leaders who had emerged from war, revolution, or depression, molded by consequence and tempered by hardship. Churchill and Roosevelt, Stalin and de Gaulle, Mao and Gandhi, figures who commanded not just armies or parliaments, but entire historical currents. For better or worse, they embodied direction. Today, leadership often seems more like management. Diplomacy is filtered through sound bites. Policies are drafted by pollsters. Charisma outpaces competence. And amid this spectacle of performance, the global stage feels increasingly leaderless. Not because power is absent, but because it is scattered, diluted by bureaucracy, contested by factions, and eroded by mistrust. In every corner of the map, we see variations of the same malaise. Presidents with dwindling approval. Parliaments paralyzed by partisanship. Populations that no longer believe promises, and sometimes, not even facts. The age of strongmen, once thought buried, now rises again in new forms, figures who offer not unity, but control. Who exploit division, not bridge it. Their appeal is not in their solutions, but in their certainty. In democracies, this crisis of leadership breeds cynicism. Voters oscillate between hope and resignation, between progressive dreams and nostalgic rage. Election cycles bring no resolution, only new slogans, new disappointments. The machinery of governance creaks under the weight of complexity. Climate, trade, migration, AI, these are problems that require long views, not short wins. But leaders increasingly govern in 280 characters or less. In autocracies, the danger runs deeper still. When power is absolute, so too is the cost of miscalculation. A single man's ego may shape a nation's future. A rumor in the palace may trigger war. And in the absence of accountability, mistakes calcify into policy, then into disaster. History is replete with such moments: Tsar Nicholas II, Saddam Hussein, the Shah of Iran, leaders who misread the world and, in so doing, unraveled it. But this is not merely a question of competence. It is a question of trust. Trust in institutions. Trust in truth. Trust in one another. A leader can only lead if someone is willing to follow. And increasingly, in an era defined by deep fakes and culture wars, conspiracy and fragmentation, that willingness is fraying. Internationally, the consequences are stark. Multilateralism stumbles. Global summits produce photo ops, not breakthroughs. Organizations meant to foster cooperation, the UN, the WTO, the WHO, find themselves paralyzed by politics. Nations drift into transactional relationships, hedging their bets with rivals, undermining allies when convenient. The global commons, once a shared responsibility, is now a contested resource. And into this vacuum steps chaos. In such a world, the risk of global conflict does not come only from ambition or ideology. It comes from a failure to steer. From leaders so preoccupied with internal survival that they overlook the signals of gathering storms. A misread provocation. A poorly handled crisis. A diplomatic insult that spirals. It has happened before. In 1914, few of the leaders who stumbled into the Great War believed it would last more than a few months. Their misjudgments killed millions. Now, as then, the channels of communication are fragile. Mistranslations. Delay. Denial. A warplane strays. A drone is shot down. A naval collision. Each moment is a test of restraint. Each leader, a hinge on which history may turn. But there is also hope. Leadership is not fate. It is choice. The world still holds statesmen and women of courage, of foresight, of empathy. Their task is harder than ever, for they must not only confront external threats, but internal disillusion. They must speak not just to power, but to fatigue. To the growing sense that no one is in charge, and that nothing can change. And yet, change begins there, with the quiet decision to listen longer, speak honestly, and act with conviction when it would be easier to defer. In a fragmented world, the greatest danger is inertia. The greatest strength is clarity. For in the end, leadership is not about commanding others. It is about being worthy of their belief. Part 22, Technological Overload and Human Vulnerability. There was a time, not so long ago, when the hum of machines was background noise. When the glow of a screen was something novel, not ambient. But now, we carry the world in our pockets and live in rooms where the silence is broken by pings, updates, and digital echoes. Technology has become the air we breathe, so omnipresent that we rarely ask how it's changing us. And that, in itself, is a quiet danger. In the shadow of global conflict, we often look to weapons, alliances, ideologies. But sometimes, the most destabilizing force is invisible, woven into the routines of ordinary people, reshaping perception and reaction without notice. The acceleration of technology has not only transformed warfare, it has rewired attention, fractured memory, and overwhelmed the senses. The threat isn't just what machines can do. It's what they are doing to us. The human mind evolved to read weather, faces, the pattern of hooves in the grass. But today it must navigate a blizzard of signals, news alerts, surveillance feeds, social algorithms, command consoles. Decision-makers, from generals to presidents, face timelines measured in seconds. A misreading of data. A deep-fake video. A false alarm from an early warning system. Any could set off a chain of events too fast to reverse. We have built tools that outpace our judgment, and we call that progress. The psychological toll is harder to quantify. Soldiers at screens launching drones thousands of miles away. Citizens numbed by constant exposure to conflict through live streams. Young minds raised in virtual worlds where violence is a reset button and rage is a currency. The distance between act and consequence has collapsed. Empathy short-circuits when horror is just another scroll away. In military terms, technology has flattened geography. Satellites watch everything. Missiles travel farther than ever. Cyber attacks can cross borders at the speed of light. But in human terms, it has done something stranger, it has deepened isolation. The more connected we become, the more fragile our shared reality seems. Two people, standing side by side, may inhabit entirely different versions of the truth. This makes consensus difficult. Dialogue nearly impossible. Peace, in such a landscape, is a mirage that shimmers and fades with each new upload. We are also living through the twilight of privacy. Entire populations are monitored, some knowingly, some not. In the name of safety, surveillance expands. In the name of convenience, data is traded. But power built on information is not always wielded wisely. It can be used to manipulate, to predict, to control. The line between protection and oppression blurs with every software update. In times of crisis, the human instinct is to simplify. But technology resists simplicity. A military satellite glitch. An AI misclassification. A hacked communication network. Each of these is a thread that, pulled in the wrong way, could unravel diplomacy or even launch catastrophe. War, once signaled by drums or declarations, could now be triggered by a software patch gone wrong. And still, amid all this, we forget how recent this transformation is. The internet, barely a generation old, has already redrawn the map of global influence. Companies rival governments. Hackers paralyze cities. A trending hashtag can shape the policies of entire states. The old hierarchies are eroding, replaced not by clear structures, but by shifting tides of information, attention, and noise. Yet within the noise, there remains a signal, an urgent question. How do we, as humans, stay human? How do we build a future where our machines extend our wisdom instead of replacing it? Where technology serves peace, not provocation. The answer may lie not in more innovation, but in pause. In spaces where leaders and citizens alike can reflect, can listen, can understand the limits of their tools and the depths of their own fallibility. For vulnerability is not weakness. It is recognition. And only through that recognition can resilience begin. The future will be wired. But whether it is also humane, that depends not on the next invention, but on the next decision. And that, at least for now, is still ours to make. Part 23, The Collapse of Shared Truth. Once, truth felt like something solid. It might have been elusive, occasionally contested, but there was a general sense, at least in the public square, that truth existed. It could be sought, debated, proven. But today, in this strange new century, truth doesn't feel like a bedrock anymore. It feels like mist. Shifting. Subjective. Multiplying. Collapsing. We live in an age where the line between fact and belief has grown perilously thin. The same event, filtered through different channels, can yield completely opposing meanings. A protest becomes a riot, or a liberation, depending on the lens. A handshake is a betrayal or a breakthrough. The camera never lies, they once said. But now the camera, and the code behind it, can be programmed to lie with astonishing precision. The collapse of shared truth is not just an intellectual crisis. It's a geopolitical fault line. Because if nations cannot even agree on what has happened, how can they possibly agree on what should happen next? In a world of fragmented realities, diplomacy becomes guesswork. Alliances are tested by rumor. Hostilities are inflamed by viral videos, some real, some not. False flags can be conjured with code. Outrage is manufactured like currency, traded in clicks, weaponized by states and actors both seen and unseen. It takes very little now to convince one population that another is evil, violent, irredeemable. And once that seed is planted, war needs no declaration. Only justification. Trust, too, is eroding, not just between nations, but within them. Citizens lose faith in institutions. Leaders speak in absolutes, not because they are certain, but because certainty sells. Doubt has become a weakness. Nuance, a liability. And so the public discourse sharpens, divides, combusts. In such an atmosphere, the old safeguards of peace, the careful negotiation, the deliberate pace, the long view, begin to falter. Impulse overtakes patience. Cynicism replaces strategy. What once required years of diplomacy can now be undone by a single tweet, a single leak, a single manipulated frame of footage. The irony is that we are more informed than ever. We are awash in data, surrounded by screens, updated by the second. And yet, rarely have we felt more disoriented. There are simply too many signals, too few anchors. The noise overwhelms. The algorithms whisper, echo, reinforce what we already believe. And so the divide deepens, not just between individuals, but between entire societies. This makes peace, true, lasting peace, exceedingly difficult. Because peace requires mutual understanding. And understanding begins with a shared premise, that what we see, hear, and know is at least based on a common reality. Without that, dialogue becomes shouting. Compromise becomes surrender. And every negotiation feels like betrayal to someone. There are moments, of course, when truth pierces through. A photo of a wounded child. A soldier weeping by a grave. A survivor telling their story in a trembling voice. These moments remind us that beneath the narratives, beyond the propaganda, reality still exists. And that truth, though battered, is not extinct. But we must search for it. Not just with our eyes, but with our ears. Not just in headlines, but in silences. Not just in what is said, but in what is withheld. Because the collapse of shared truth is not inevitable. It is a symptom. Of speed. Of fear. Of a world that has confused information with wisdom. And healing that fracture will not come through more noise, but through something quieter, something harder, humility. The humility to admit what we don't know. To listen across divisions. To seek clarity without certainty. In a time when truth is treated as a battlefield, to protect it is an act of courage. To seek it is an act of peace. And so we drift forward, not yet at war, but no longer fully at peace. Navigating a world where the maps are smudged, the compass needles spin, and the stars overhead no longer point as clearly as they once did. But still we move, because even in a fog of uncertainty, the quiet pursuit of truth may be the only light we have left. Part 24, The Future of International Institutions. There was a time when the world looked toward its institutions with a certain reverence. Not perfect, no, but pillars. The United Nations, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, NATO, each born of war's aftermath, forged in the belief that unity, even in its messiest form, was better than chaos. These were the great cathedrals of diplomacy, vast and slow-moving, but deliberate in their mission, to speak for many, to guard against the unthinkable. Yet as the decades passed, something changed. The institutions remained, but the faith in them began to fade. Perhaps it was inevitable. The world moved faster. Crises came quicker, sharper. Wars no longer declared themselves formally. Economies rose and collapsed with a flicker on a screen. Viruses spread in weeks. Hackers destabilized elections. And in this new terrain, the old bodies often moved like giants in molasses, slow, procedural, paralyzed by politics and vetoes. Nations began to turn inward. Populism surged. Multilateralism sounded quaint, even naive, in an era where strongmen boasted of strength and borders. The institutions, once the hallmarks of global cooperation, now found themselves accused of irrelevance or bias. Some were defunded. Others were bypassed. Treaties unraveled. Summits grew more performative and purposeful. But the need for these institutions didn't vanish, it grew. Because in a fractured world, problems do not respect flags. Climate, pandemics, cyber attacks, refugee flows, nuclear threats, none of these challenges care who sits in which capital or who casts which vote. They are global by design. And so the irony deepens, just as the world grows more interconnected, it also grows more divided in how it governs that interconnection. So where does that leave us? Some say the institutions are crumbling, that they are relics of a post-World War II order now fading into history. Others argue they are evolving, slowly, painfully, towards something more adaptable. Regional blocs rise where global consensus fails. Informal alliances and digital coalitions step in where traditional charters stall. The machinery of diplomacy doesn't stop, it simply reshapes. But the question lingers, can these institutions survive the strain of a world they were never built to manage? They were designed in an age of telegrams and typewriters. Now, we live in a world of artificial intelligence, bioengineering, and real-time disinformation. The threats are faster. The stakes are higher. And the margin for error is thinner. Yet still, the buildings stand. The blue flags flutter. The speeches echo in the halls. And within them are people, diplomats, scientists, bureaucrats, trying, still, to hold something together. Not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity. Because if the institutions fall entirely, what takes their place? Anarchy does not create peace. A vacuum does not create order. And while institutions may be flawed, they are at least mechanisms, imperfect gears that grind toward resolution, however slowly. Without them, every crisis becomes a test of brute force. Every disagreement becomes a standoff. There is still hope, quietly, beneath the noise. In new frameworks forged around climate agreements. In international cooperation during health emergencies. In joint missions to monitor space, explore the deep sea, regulate emerging technology. These moments, rare and fleeting, remind us that collaboration is not dead, it's simply harder now. Perhaps the future of international institutions is not in grandeur, but in humility. Not in dominating the world stage, but in quietly weaving together the frayed threads of trust. Small agreements. Measured wins. Shared language in a time of shouting. Maybe they must become less like fortresses, and more like bridges. Flexible. Resilient. Rooted not in bureaucracy, but in listening. And as we drift deeper into a century shaped by uncertainty, we may one day rediscover what the architects of peace always knew, that strength lies not only in armies or economies, but in our willingness to sit at a table, even when we disagree. Especially when we disagree. Because the future may not belong to those who shout the loudest, but to those who choose, still, to speak together. Part 25, The Shifting Morality of War. Once, war had rules, at least, that's what we told ourselves. There were lines that could not be crossed, standards that, even in the chaos of battle, were meant to be honored. The Geneva Conventions were not just documents, they were declarations of our humanity amid inhuman acts. Soldiers wore uniforms, civilians were to be spared, surrender meant survival. But those lines are blurring now, and the old moral codes are slipping, one grain at a time, through the cracks of a new kind of conflict. Today's battlefield is no longer a field. It's a hospital ward bombed by a drone. A classroom caught in the crossfire. A fiber optic cable pulsing with code meant to disable a nation's power grid. The modern face of war wears many masks, some invisible, others indistinguishable from peace. War today isn't always declared. It doesn't always come with parades or proclamations. Sometimes it whispers through propaganda. Sometimes it flickers on a satellite feed. And in this shifting landscape, morality struggles to keep its footing. What does collateral damage mean when a drone strike kills a family in the name of national security? What does combatant mean when cyber warriors operate from behind keyboards thousands of miles from any front line? What does proportional response look like in a world of asymmetry, where a small militant group in a nuclear state can be entangled in the same headlines? The lines are not just blurred, they are being redrawn, daily. Technology accelerates the problem. Artificial intelligence makes decisions in milliseconds that once required human judgment. Autonomous weapons raise questions no philosopher has fully answered. If a machine decides who lives and dies, where do we place responsibility? And what happens to accountability when the weapon has no conscience? But the real moral erosion may not lie in machines. It may lie in our own tolerance. In the way global audiences consume war like newsreels, scrolling past rubble and bloodshed with numb thumbs. In the way moral outrage burns bright and fast and then disappears with the next headline. In the way civilian suffering becomes statistical, 40 killed here, 60 there, and soon, we forget the names. Some argue that war has always been immoral, and that to search for ethics in carnage is naive. But there is a deeper truth beneath that cynicism, that even in the darkest chapters, humans have tried to place limits on horror. Not always successfully. But the attempt matters. The attempt reminds us that we are not yet lost. Today, that attempt feels strained. Nations weaponize misinformation. Mercenaries and militias operate in legal gray zones. War crimes are documented in real time, yet perpetrators often go unpunished. And still, the world watches, sometimes helplessly, sometimes silently. Yet morality in war is not a relic. It is a compass, however cracked. And though the needle spins wildly now, it still points somewhere. There are voices calling for a new framework, an updated code for 21st century conflict. One that addresses cyber attacks, disinformation, climate-triggered unrest. One that reasserts the value of civilian life in all its fragile, sacred forms. One that demands responsibility even in the murkiest of wars. It will not be easy. The incentives to ignore morality are strong. Expediency is quicker. Vengeance is louder. But the cost of abandoning those principles altogether is far higher. Because without a shared sense of right and wrong, war becomes not just destructive, but senseless. And senseless wars never end. So we stand at a crossroads. One path bends toward the erosion of ethics in favor of efficiency. The other leads toward something more difficult, a reaffirmation of the belief that how we fight matters, not just who wins. That restraint is not weakness. That justice is not optional. That morality in war is not a contradiction, but a necessity. Because if we lose that, we lose not only the battle, but ourselves. Part 26, Migration, Borders, and the New Fault Lines of Identity. People have always moved. Across valleys and deserts, over mountains and seas, the story of humanity has been a story of footsteps, of leaving one home in search of another. Sometimes those migrations were slow, voluntary, a caravan winding its way across the sand, a family sailing toward distant shores. Sometimes they were desperate, driven by famine, by war, by the slow erosion of hope. But today, migration is no longer just a story of movement. It is a pressure point. A trigger. A fracture line. In the 21st century, the world is seeing movement on a scale unseen in modern times. Climate change pushes people from flooded deltas and parched farmlands. Conflicts, both civil and global, drive families into exile. Economic instability renders entire regions inhospitable. And in the shadows of these movements lie borders, lines drawn not just on maps, but etched into national identities, guarded by walls, policies, and fear. Borders, once seen as symbols of sovereignty, now tremble under the weight of crisis. Barbed wire fences cut across frozen forests. Detention camps rise in coastal cities. Bureaucracy and surveillance turn migration into a gauntlet. And as numbers grow, so too does the rhetoric, louder, sharper, angrier. Because behind every wave of migration, there is a deeper anxiety: who are we, and who gets to be among us? Nations built on shared myths now struggle with pluralism. The foreigner becomes a symbol, not of difference, but of danger. Refugees are framed not as people seeking safety, but as invaders, as threats to tradition, to jobs, to imagined purity. And yet, the migrants keep walking, because the places behind them are no longer livable. They walk with children in their arms and memories in their pockets. They carry languages that may never be heard again. They do not ask for much, only a place to begin again. But in receiving nations, political lines harden. Nationalist parties rise. Immigration becomes the wedge issue, the spark in parliaments in prime time. The discourse turns coarse, then cruel. Laws are passed to restrict, to detain, to deport. And in the process, borders stop being just geographical, they become ideological. Psychological. The line between us and them becomes more than just policy, it becomes identity. And identity, once destabilized, becomes combustible. Across continents, we now witness the rise of what some call the politics of belonging. It asks a single, loaded question: who truly belongs? Is it a matter of birthplace, of blood, of belief? Can identity stretch to include newcomers, or must it retreat into the familiar past? For some, the answer is expansion. For others, it is defense. And here lies the fault line. Because migration, at its core, is not just a logistical challenge. It is a moral test. A cultural reckoning. It forces societies to confront the stories they tell about themselves. Are they nations of refuge, of inclusion, of opportunity? Or are they fortresses, fragile and unwelcoming? The future will offer no easy answers. As the climate warms and economies strain, more people will be on the move. The waves will not recede. The question is not whether people will come, but how the world will respond. Will it meet migration with empathy, or with barbed wire? With policy rooted in humanity, or in fear? Already, some leaders understand that rigid borders cannot hold back the tide. That sustainable migration policy requires cooperation, compassion, and imagination. That integration is not assimilation, but dialogue. That to welcome is not to erase, but to evolve. Others, however, see only threat. And they will build higher walls. But history shows that walls, no matter how high, cannot stop human need. They cannot hold back the wind, or the rising seas, or the hunger in a mother's eyes. So we return to a quiet truth: people move. And when they do, the world changes, not always peacefully, not always easily. But if managed with grace, these movements can become moments of rebirth, not rupture. If not, the pressure will build. And like all fault lines, it may one day break. Part 27, Urbanization, Megacities, and the Collapse of Local Identity. In the quiet corners of the world where fields once stretched toward low hills and where children knew the names of every neighbor, something is disappearing, not with the roar of conflict or the force of disaster, but with the slow inevitability of gravity. It is the vanishing of the local. The erasure of place. The quiet drowning of identity beneath the rising tide of concrete and glass. For in the 21st century, humanity is no longer scattering across the earth, it is clustering. Crowding. Rising skyward. Megacities are the monuments of our era. Towering, glowing, pulsing with life. From Lagos to Jakarta, Sao Paulo to Karachi, they swell beyond design, beyond control, drawing millions into their orbit. Every day, more people arrive, migrants from rural lands, families fleeing droughts or seeking wages, the hopeful, the desperate, the dreamers. They bring with them dialects, recipes, memories of small villages. And in exchange, the city gives them anonymity, movement, and noise. But something else is traded too, rootedness. As the countryside empties and megacities rise, the slow rhythms of traditional life are eclipsed. Seasonal festivals, once tied to harvests or village legends, fall away. Languages that were once sung in marketplaces or whispered in temples are replaced by the blunt uniformity of urban tongues. Identity, once tied to land and lineage, is now shaped by transit routes, high-rise clusters, and fleeting social feeds. In the blur of modernity, the self becomes weightless. And the city, for all its power, rarely offers belonging. It offers opportunity, but not always connection. People live stacked above one another, millions in motion, but few in community. A man might share a wall with his neighbor but never know their name. A child might grow up surrounded by faces yet feel entirely alone. This collapse of the local has consequences. In losing smallness, we lose memory. Not the grand history written in books, but the quiet kind. How the sun hits a certain street at dusk, the story behind a well, the taste of bread baked only in one village in one valley. These are not global things. They are fragile. And once gone, they do not return. As megacities expand, the old ways are not just forgotten, they are buried. Paved over. Replaced by malls and motorways. And as identity frays, people begin to grasp for something, anything, that feels solid. They join movements, cling to ideologies, wear uniforms of belief. Not because they are angry, but because they are unmoored. A person who has lost their place will often seek it in symbols. And in this great urban churn, something else takes root, sameness. Global brands replace local artisans. Apartment blocks look the same in Seoul as they do in Bogota. Cultural uniqueness gives way to convenience. Everywhere becomes somewhere else. And everywhere becomes nowhere. The megacity becomes not a home, but a hive. Efficient. Functional. But also brittle. Vulnerable to collapse not from without, but from within, through isolation, alienation, a quiet despair that no skyline can hide. Yet within this darkness, there is still light. Some resist the erasure. In the alleys of old quarters, elders pass down recipes and songs. Community gardens bloom between high-rises. Murals reclaim blank walls with memory. Even in the tallest towers, people light incense for ancestors, hang charms from doorknobs, whisper stories to their children in the old tongue. Because deep down, humans do not just want shelter. They want to belong. They want to know that where they are matters. That it has roots. The challenge for the future is not just to build bigger cities, but to build places. Places with texture, memory, and soul. Urbanization need not mean obliteration. But it will, unless we remember that local identity is not an obstacle to progress, it is its foundation. Without it, we may have cities, but we will have lost civilization. Part 28, Religion, Extremism, and the Global Strain on Belief. Across the centuries, belief has been both a lantern and a sword. It has lit paths through despair, offered meaning where none seemed to exist, and stitched together lives with shared rituals, whispered prayers, and sacred texts passed from generation to generation. And yet, in other hands, belief has become a blade, sharpened not for enlightenment but for dominance. It is within this tension that the modern world finds itself, suspended between faith as comfort and faith as conflict. In today's age of dizzying connectivity and information overload, the ancient rhythms of religion continue to hum beneath the surface. In village mosques, forest chapels, mountain stupas, and urban synagogues, people gather. Not always because they fear the unknown, but because belief offers continuity. In a world that spins faster by the hour, religion speaks the language of the eternal. It promises that there is something beyond currency, power, and fleeting fame. Something worth kneeling for. But belief, when strained, does not always stretch, it sometimes snaps. The global order has frayed. Wars of ideology have faded into wars of identity. Where once borders were drawn in the sand, now they are etched in hearts and echoed in algorithms. Faith, for many, has become a battlefield, not only between religions, but within them. Sectarianism blooms where understanding withers. And extremism takes root in places where hope has died. It is a quiet crisis. One not always televised. But you can feel it in the whispers online, in the sermons grown more militant, in the fear that creeps into schoolbooks, city councils, and refugee camps. Not because people are born hateful, but because in an age of uncertainty, absolutism feels like safety. A promise. A line that cannot be crossed. And yet that line is drawn again and again, in blood. The global strain on belief is not simply about radicals and their rhetoric. It is about the slow erosion of nuance. The fading art of coexistence. In cities where minarets once stood beside cathedrals, suspicion now festers. In neighborhoods where shared festivals once bridged the divine, now silence replaces celebration. Religion has not failed. But in many places, it has been failed, used as a tool for power, profit, or populism. Faith becomes a uniform, not a calling. Doctrine replaces dialogue. And the sacred is weaponized. But even in this shadow, there are those who resist. They are quiet monks tending ancient texts. Imams speaking of mercy. Rabbis teaching peace in small rooms filled with light. Pastors walking alongside the homeless. Sikhs cooking for strangers. Hindus planting trees in the name of gods who dwell in forests. They are not on headlines, but they are everywhere. Holding belief not as a wall, but as a bridge. As a thread that binds, not blinds. The question facing the world is not whether belief will endure, it will. The question is, in what form? Will it be one that isolates, drawing lines between us and them, imagining salvation as a zero-sum game? Or will it be one that reclaims wonder? That sees the divine in difference, not despite it. Extremism feeds on despair. On disconnection. It grows in the cracks of broken economies, failed states, and forgotten lives. And in that soil, belief becomes less about God and more about grievance. Less about prayer and more about power. And yet, for billions, faith remains a compass, not to violence, but to compassion. It instructs how to grieve, how to forgive, how to sit with the dying. It marks time, binds families, and reminds the weary that their pain is seen, that their story matters. As the world teeters between division and unity, religion may yet shape the road ahead, not through conquest, but through humility. Through listening. Through the courage to admit that no one holds all the answers, and that the sacred does not fear questions. Because in the end, belief is not a fortress, it is a flame. And in dark times, it can still light the way forward. Part 29, Weaponized Faith in the Political Machine. There is a point where belief ceases to be personal and becomes performance. Where sacred words are no longer whispered in quiet reverence, but shouted through megaphones, etched into laws, and draped across political banners. When faith, once tender and transcendent, is recruited into the machinery of power, it changes, not in its essence, but in its purpose. And when that purpose shifts from healing to control, from mercy to manipulation, the soul of a people is quietly rewritten. We live in an age where religion is once again a potent tool, not just for the devout, but for those who know how to wield symbols better than swords. Politicians, generals, and populists have learned that faith can be far more persuasive than fear, and far more enduring than force. In speech after speech, campaign after campaign, we hear ancient scripture reinterpreted not for spiritual clarity, but for ideological dominance. It begins subtly. A law cloaked in morality. A leader invoking divine favor. A protest repainted as a crusade. It doesn't take long before the language of righteousness is used to silence dissent. Critics are labeled heretics. Outsiders, infidels. Loyalty to country is fused with loyalty to creed. And to question one becomes an act of betrayal to both. In such climates, compromise dies. Because when political identity is fused with religious destiny, every concession feels like blasphemy. Every opposing vote becomes an existential threat. And soon, policy becomes prophecy. Democracy, which thrives on dialogue, chokes on dogma. This is not new. History is littered with regimes that cloak their ambitions in the robes of the priesthood. From medieval inquisitions to modern theocracies, faith has long been drafted into the service of statecraft. But what is perhaps more dangerous today is how seamless it has become, how easily the sacred is woven into the fabric of nationalism, how religion becomes less a belief system and more a brand. And the people caught in the middle? They are not zealots or tyrants, but ordinary men and women, teachers, bakers, farmers, mothers, who just want peace, but are taught to fear their neighbors. Who grow up learning that to love their God, they must distrust someone else's. Who are never told that true faith has nothing to prove, and even less to impose. Of course, not all political leaders weaponize religion. Many respect its place, protect its freedom, and understand that the state must serve a diverse citizenry. But the line is delicate. And in moments of crisis, economic collapse, mass migration, cultural unrest, that line is easy to cross. Especially when it wins elections. Especially when it rallies the disillusioned. Especially when it silences critics with divine finality. Yet belief, once politicized, becomes brittle. It no longer grows, it calcifies. The sacred texts become tools of exclusion. The rituals, markers of loyalty. And eventually, the faith that once elevated the soul begins to fracture societies. But there is another way. Faith can still inspire public service, not through coercion, but compassion. Not through legislation, but example. It can remind leaders that power is temporary, that justice matters more than approval ratings, and that truth is not decided by polls. It can guide without governing. Bless without bullying. Unite without uniformity. The task before us is not to banish faith from the public square, but to guard it from being co-opted. To protect the freedom to believe, while refusing to let belief be twisted into policy that harms. To see the line between moral conviction and political domination, and have the courage not to cross it. Because when religion becomes a machine, it forgets how to pray. And when politics borrows robes it was never meant to wear, both church and state become poorer for it. Part 30, The Search for Meaning in an Age of Noise. The world has never been louder. Every second, 1,000 opinions bloom and fade across glowing screens. News headlines scream urgency. Influencers declare truth. Algorithms whisper what we should believe, what we should buy, what we should fear. And somewhere beneath this avalanche of voices, many of us begin to ask a question older than history: what am I doing here? It is not a question of location, but of direction. Not of survival, but of significance. In a world bursting with connection, it is easy to feel disconnected from ourselves. In a time when answers are always a search bar away, meaning becomes elusive, not because it's hidden, but because it's drowned. Our ancestors sought meaning in the stars, in the cycle of the seasons, in the stories passed down by firelight. They carved it into stone, whispered it through ritual, risked their lives for it. Meaning was not a luxury, it was a necessity, something to hold on to in a world they did not control. But today, in an age that promises comfort and efficiency, we are told that meaning is optional. That it can be substituted with productivity, with entertainment, with consumption. And yet, despite all our progress, the hunger remains. Because meaning is not noise. It's silence noticed. It's the pause before a child's laugh. The ache in your chest when you hear a song that sounds like home. It's the moment you look up from your screen and realize the sun is setting, and you don't know where the day went. It is in the questions we don't have to ask, but can't help asking anyway. Questions like, who am I, without the roles I play? What do I believe in, when no one's watching? And what will be left of me, when all the noise fades? In the past, faith, family, and nation often supplied ready-made answers. But today, those structures are fracturing. Many grow up untethered, skeptical of religion, wary of ideology, raised on the doctrine of self-creation. And so, the search becomes solitary. Each person a world unto themselves, building meaning from fragments, from borrowed ideas and fleeting moments of clarity. Some find it in activism, fighting for a cause larger than themselves. Others in creativity, in the act of making something that did not exist before. Some turn inward, seeking peace through meditation, mindfulness, the quiet disciplines of the soul. Others find it in relationships, intimacy as a compass, love as a lighthouse. But for many, the search is exhausting. Because the noise never stops. The scroll never ends. We compare ourselves endlessly. We measure our worth in likes, in metrics, in relevance. We are told to brand ourselves, to market our authenticity, to turn our lives into content. And the deeper truth, raw, uncertain, unprofitable, is quietly exiled. In such a world, the act of simply being becomes radical. To turn off the noise, to walk without headphones, to write a journal no one will read, to look someone in the eye and really listen, these are not small things. They are rebellion. They are resistance. They are how we reclaim the spaces where meaning can grow. Because meaning does not announce itself. It does not shout or trend. It arrives quietly, sometimes painfully, in the gap between what we expected and what life gave us. It waits in grief. It lingers in joy. It is stitched into the rituals we keep for no practical reason, lighting a candle, planting a tree, saying a name aloud. And if we are to survive, not just as a civilization, but as individuals, we must learn to listen again. To choose depth over volume. To sit, even briefly, in the sacred discomfort of not knowing. Because only in stillness can we hear the answers that were waiting all along. Part 31, Psychological Fatigue in the Collective Consciousness. It happens slowly at first, an unnoticed drift beneath the surface of ordinary days. You forget a word mid-sentence. You scroll through the news but feel nothing. You reach for your phone before you've even opened your eyes. It's not exhaustion in the traditional sense, not the tiredness cured by a night's sleep. It's something deeper, something more profound. A kind of spiritual weariness that builds quietly within the population of a world perpetually on edge. It is psychological fatigue, not just of individuals, but of entire societies. For decades, the world has pressed forward, faster, louder, busier. Each crisis bleeds into the next. Economic downturns, political scandals, terror attacks, pandemics, wars, environmental warnings, cyber breaches. There is always something. And while each shock might feel survivable on its own, their accumulation begins to dull the senses. The collective mind absorbs too much and processes too little. Eventually, a strange numbness settles in, not from ignorance, but from saturation. We live in the age of the infinite feed. There is no endpoint, no conclusion, no fade to black. Every headline promises urgency, every update insists on your attention. Yet nothing is resolved. No great victory is declared. No clear villain defeated. The stories swirl and overlap, and the noise becomes a kind of background hum, ever-present and inescapable. In such a state, it's no wonder people begin to retreat, not just from the world, but from themselves. Across cities and continents, people report feeling more anxious, more isolated, more powerless. Not because they don't care, but because they care too much and have nowhere to place that care. Empathy, stretched beyond its capacity, begins to fray. The emotional bandwidth of the average person has long since been overwhelmed, yet the demands continue. Be informed. Be alert. Be productive. Be outraged. Be perfect. Be okay. And yet, few are. This fatigue seeps into everything. It affects how we trust our leaders, how we raise our children, how we imagine the future. It fosters apathy in civic life, cynicism in politics, and resignation in the face of injustice. People stop voting not because they don't believe in democracy, but because they no longer believe they are part of it. People stop hoping not because they are cold, but because they are tired of being let down. But there is something deeper still, a shared awareness, unspoken yet widely felt, that the very systems we once relied upon are faltering. The idea that the future will always be better no longer feels like a certainty, but a question mark. For many, particularly the young, the world feels like a house with cracks in the foundation, still standing but creaking ominously with every passing year. This is the weight of collective consciousness, the burden of knowing too much, of feeling responsible yet helpless. And it manifests not only in anxiety and despair, but also in distraction, denial, and detachment. We binge, we joke, we doom scroll. We build entire cultures around irony and avoidance because sincerity feels too raw. But even in this fatigue, there is a quiet kind of unity. A recognition that many of us are carrying the same weight, even if we rarely speak of it aloud. In silent glances on crowded trains, in tired smiles at the end of a shift, in shared silence after another tragedy, we are bound not just by fear, but by weariness. And perhaps, in that weariness, lies a small seed of something powerful. Because when enough people feel the same weight, they may eventually look for ways to lighten it, not just for themselves, but for each other. They may begin to imagine new ways of living, new rhythms of existence not built on constant acceleration and overload. They may begin to prioritize rest, empathy, and depth, not as luxuries, but as survival tools. In the fog of fatigue, clarity can emerge. A new kind of resilience, not forged in fire but in stillness. Not in shouting, but in listening. And in remembering, always, that while the mind can be overwhelmed, the human spirit, when connected to others, can still heal. Part 32, The Role of Education in Preventing Global Conflict. In the quiet corridors of classrooms and the hush of libraries, in the murmured conversations between students and the careful scribbles of chalk on ancient blackboards, lies a subtle but profound defense against the madness of war. Not every weapon is forged from steel. Some are bound in paper, inked with thought, passed down through minds rather than barrels. Education, patient, consistent, and quietly revolutionary, has long been humanity's most enduring hope against the cycles of conflict that have haunted it through the ages. But not just any education. It is not enough to fill a mind with facts, names, and dates. The kind of education that shapes peace is not merely informative, it is transformative. It teaches empathy alongside arithmetic, critical thinking alongside chemistry. It asks not just what happened in history, but why, and what it meant to the people who lived it. It recognizes that understanding another culture is as vital as knowing the structure of a sentence or the laws of physics. In places where conflict has brewed, often for generations, the failure to educate with empathy is clear. Young minds are fed narratives steeped in fear and grievance, learning the language of us versus them before they even understand the maps on their classroom walls. History becomes a weapon, bent into a justification for present rage. Geography becomes a barrier, not a bridge. And in this way, children inherit not just the land of their forebears, but their wars. But imagine a different kind of classroom. One where a Palestinian child reads the poetry of an Israeli peer, and an Israeli student traces the family tree of a Bedouin tribe. One where a North Korean student learns not only calculus but the life story of a South Korean grandmother. One where textbooks do not omit inconvenient truths but confront them directly, with dignity, with nuance, and with a clear-eyed desire for reconciliation rather than righteousness. These are not utopian dreams. They are possibilities, already being tested quietly in shared schools, international curricula, and brave experimental programs scattered across the globe. Education can humanize the enemy. And that is one of its greatest powers. It can reveal that behind the flags and the factions are people not so different, people who laugh, mourn, struggle, and hope. It can foster humility in the face of complexity. It can challenge dogma, dissolve stereotypes, and provide the young with the tools to ask better questions before someone hands them a weapon and insists on answers. But it is not easy. And it is not without opposition. There are forces in every society that fear open minds, who view critical thinking as dangerous, and who see peace itself as a threat to power. In authoritarian regimes, education is often the first institution to be controlled and the last to be freed. Even in liberal democracies, education budgets are often among the first to be cut, and the teaching of history is fiercely politicized. And yet, the slow work of education continues. A teacher in a war-torn town stands before a small group of students and speaks of the Enlightenment. A professor in exile lectures over video call about human rights. A child, clutching a donated book, reads about a world they've never seen and imagines it might someday be their own. These are the quiet rebellions against the thunder of war. These are the seeds from which new generations might rise, not eager to avenge the past but determined to write a future in which peace is not simply the absence of conflict but the presence of understanding. Education, done right, does not guarantee peace. But its absence almost guarantees war. Because without education, fear flourishes. Ignorance calcifies into hatred. And in the absence of questions, the loudest answers, often violent ones, go unchallenged. So perhaps the path away from a third world war does not begin in a summit or a treaty, but in a classroom. In the moment a child asks why, and is not silenced. In the moment a teacher dares to teach something uncomfortable, and a student dares to consider it. In the decision to fund schools instead of missiles, and to value the long, slow work of changing minds over the quick, brutal work of breaking bodies. That is the work of peace. And it begins, always, with education. Part 33, The Role of Memory, How We Remember War Shapes Whether We Repeat It. Memory is not just what we carry within us, it is what we construct as a society, and what we choose to pass on. It lives in monuments and museums, in textbooks and films, in the whispered recollections of veterans and the solemn silence of memorial ceremonies. How we remember war is never neutral. It can be a mirror or a mask. It can be a plea for peace or a prelude to vengeance. Some nations remember their wars with bowed heads and solemn voices. Others, with parades and anthems. In some countries, war is taught as tragedy, a lesson in hubris, suffering, and human error. In others, it is packaged as glory, a narrative of heroism and divine purpose. And within each country, within each family, the stories splinter and fragment, some remembered vividly, some buried so deeply they begin to rot, unspoken but never quite forgotten. In this way, memory becomes a battlefield of its own. The stories we elevate, the victories we celebrate, the atrocities we omit, shape the identity of generations. A young person who learns only of their nation's triumphs may grow up unable to imagine its failures. A society that never discusses its role as aggressor may find it easier to become one again. Conversely, a society that only remembers its suffering may grow paranoid, defensive, suspicious of the world. In both cases, memory distorts, and war becomes easier to justify. But memory can also heal. When survivors tell their stories, not just of how they fought, but of how they suffered, how they fled, how they lost, it plants a seed of caution. It reminds us that war is not abstract. It is not maps and troop movements and flags. It is children hiding under staircases. It is hunger and cold and screams in the night. It is mothers burying sons, and soldiers burying parts of themselves they will never recover. This kind of memory builds empathy. And empathy is a barricade against indifference. Yet even memory is vulnerable to manipulation. Governments have long known the power of history's pen. What is remembered, and what is erased, can serve the needs of those in power. Textbooks are rewritten. Dates are shifted. Symbols are redefined. An invasion becomes a liberation. A massacre becomes an unfortunate incident. The victims are blamed, or forgotten. And the memory of war becomes a tool, not of caution, but of control. In authoritarian states, this is done openly. In democracies, it is more subtle. But in either case, the result is the same: memory is edited for usefulness, rather than truth. Still, there are those who resist. Archivists who preserve brittle letters no one else wants. Teachers who tell the full story, even when it is uncomfortable. Grandparents who sit their grandchildren down and say, "I want you to know what happened." Artists who paint not just the battlefield, but the hospital, the refugee camp, the grave. These are the stewards of true memory, not perfect, but honest. Not comprehensive, but sincere. And through their efforts, we begin to build something stronger than history. We build a shared consciousness. A collective understanding that war, however it begins, always ends the same way, in loss. And once that understanding takes root, it becomes harder to silence the voices that ask, "Is this worth it?" before the first missile flies. The role of memory is not to prevent all conflict, no memory can do that. But it can slow us down. It can introduce hesitation. It can ensure that before we fall into war, we remember what it was like the last time we crawled out of it. It is no accident that those who want war often seek first to erase or reshape the memories of the last one. And it is no coincidence that peace builders begin by listening to the stories others are trying to forget. So if there is hope to be found, it may lie here, not in forgetting the past, but in remembering it better. More honestly. More painfully. And more completely. Because how we remember war determines how easily we repeat it. Part 34, The Influence of Youth and Generational Shifts. In every age, it is the youth who inherit the world shaped by the choices of those who came before. They are born into systems they did not create, inherit ideologies they did not choose, and are asked to solve problems they did not cause. Yet within them lies the energy of possibility, the capacity to reshape the world through vision, defiance, and reinvention. The influence of youth is not always loud or immediate, but it is relentless. It flows forward like a river, carving through stone over time. Each generation carries its own memory, its own lens, and its own burdens. Those who grew up during wartime may carry caution, scars, or even silent traumas that shape how they raise their children. Those born in the aftermath may swing between reverence for peace and curiosity about the past's violent grandeur. And those born into comfort and stability may question the very foundations their parents clung to. History is not just inherited through books, it is transmitted through habits, assumptions, and the quiet rhythms of family life. But generational change is not linear. The youth of one era may rise with fiery idealism, calling for peace, equality, and a more humane world, only for their children to rebel against their passivity and demand order, tradition, or strength. Cycles emerge, where generations alternate between building bridges and fortifying walls. What matters, then, is not just the presence of youth, but how they are shaped, by education, by opportunity, by what they are allowed to question and who they are encouraged to listen to. In today's world, the young are more globally connected than ever before. They grow up in a digital sea of information, exposed to cultures, crises, and conversations far beyond their own borders. A teenager in Indonesia may be following protests in Iran. A student in Brazil may be learning about droughts in Sudan. The internet has shattered the illusion that one nation's struggles are its own. For many young people, identity is layered, national, regional, digital, ideological, and the old tribal lines feel blurrier. But this connectivity is a double-edged sword. The same platforms that expose young people to global pain also overwhelm them with conflicting truths. Misinformation spreads faster than facts. Outrage replaces reflection. Algorithms feed confirmation bias, trapping even the most curious minds in echo chambers. And amidst it all, there is a growing fatigue, a numbness in the face of too many crises, too little control. Still, youth resists despair. Again and again, they organize, innovate, and demand better. From climate marches to racial justice movements, from school walkouts to online activism, young people are finding ways to turn inherited anxiety into collective action. They are less bound by Cold War loyalties, more skeptical of nationalism, and often more attuned to the intersections of injustice across borders. And yet, power rarely moves easily from one generation to the next. Older leaders cling to old frameworks, invoking the dangers of naivety or the need for experience. Institutions lag behind the values of the populations they claim to represent. Change feels urgent to the young, but threatening to the old. This generational tension is not new, but in an age of accelerated crisis, it is more visible and more consequential. Because the decisions made today, about war, climate, technology, governance, will define the landscape the next generation must navigate. And the longer their voices are sidelined, the greater the risk that the future being built will not reflect those who must live in it. To understand whether the world is heading toward another great war, we must ask not just what the powerful are doing, but what the young are dreaming. Are they inheriting a world that teaches them to fear, to hate, to isolate? Or are they being shown how to imagine something different? Hope does not lie in age, but in courage. And the courage of youth, though often dismissed, is the kind that topples walls, rewrites constitutions, and redefines what is possible. Whether that courage will be nurtured or crushed, that may be one of the most decisive questions of our time. Part 35. The Media's Mirror, Shaping Perception in a Fragmented World. In every era of upheaval, the way stories are told shapes how events are remembered. Today, more than at any other moment in history, the media functions not merely as a window to the world, but as a mirror, one that reflects, distorts, magnifies, and at times shatters reality. From news anchors to influencers, from newspapers to live streams, we are surrounded by voices that do not just inform us, but define the contours of our perception. In a fragmented world, where truth feels negotiable and outrage is currency, the media stands at the heart of our collective nervous system. But the word media now means many things. It no longer refers only to the legacy institutions once trusted as gatekeepers of fact. It now includes millions of individuals with phones and platforms, citizen journalists capturing moments in real time, and entire algorithms designed to feed each of us a version of the world we already believe in. News has become personalized, curated to our biases, filtered through values we may not even be aware we hold. And in that shift, the line between perception and propaganda blurs. Once, wartime journalism took days, even weeks, to reach the masses. Today, a single image of a burning building or a wounded child can circle the globe in seconds. The velocity of information is both its power and its peril. The same tools that allow us to expose atrocities also make it possible to manufacture them: deep fakes, misinformation, synthetic narratives engineered to inflame rather than to illuminate. In such a storm of content, it becomes harder to pause, to verify, to trust. And yet we continue to build our opinions, our fears, our sense of who is enemy and who is ally, on the scaffolding of what we consume. Media narratives do not merely report the world, they construct it. The words chosen, the headlines written, the voices elevated or silenced, these decisions shape public mood, influence elections, and even tilt nations toward conflict or peace. The media can be a bomb or a blade. In fractured societies, this power becomes even more potent. Polarization thrives when echo chambers are nurtured, when each side sees only the worst of the other, amplified and repeated until empathy is eclipsed by fear. The media, when driven by profit or agenda rather than by public service, finds reward in division. Outrage drives clicks. Fear holds attention. Simplicity sells in a world that is anything but simple. This is not just a Western phenomenon. Around the globe, media landscapes are being shaped by strongmen, by state actors, by digital armies of bots and trolls. In some places, the media is a tool of resistance. In others, it is the mouthpiece of repression. But everywhere, it is pivotal. Control the narrative, and you shape the battlefield long before a single shot is fired. And yet, despite this, there remains hope in the cracks. Independent journalists risk their lives to tell the truth. Filmmakers document injustice. Writers challenge the prevailing winds of power. New platforms emerge, committed to transparency and nuance. There is a hunger, not always loud, but steady, for depth, for honesty, for the kind of storytelling that does not scream, but listens. The question is not whether the media will shape our future, it already does. The question is whether we, as individuals and societies, will learn to question what we see. To hold space for complexity. To consume with care, and speak with humility. Because in a fragmented world, clarity does not come from louder voices, but from wiser ones. As nations face the possibility of global conflict, the role of the media cannot be underestimated. It will influence who we blame, who we fear, who we grieve for, and who we ignore. It will decide whether we see the suffering of others as distant noise or as a shared human wound. And in that decision lies the power to pull us closer together, or tear us further apart. We must ask ourselves, is our view of the world our own, or was it handed to us by someone with something to sell? Part 36, The Disintegration of Empathy in an Age of Overexposure. There was a time when the image of a single starving child or the story of a distant war could move millions. One photo, one letter from a journalist on the front lines, could stir compassion, mobilize aid, and shift the course of public opinion. But today, in a world saturated with suffering, where every scroll offers a new horror, where tragedy competes for attention with entertainment, we are witnessing something quietly corrosive: the slow disintegration of empathy. Empathy, by nature, demands space. It asks for stillness, for the chance to imagine another's life in detail and with care. But in an age of constant exposure, where the heart has no time to rest before being pierced again, that space collapses. The images still come, bleeding, broken, pleading, but where once they might have sparked action, now they risk only a flicker of recognition before we move on. Another child under rubble. Another mother screaming. Another headline of devastation. And still, the algorithm urges us forward. This is not because we are cruel. It is because we are overwhelmed. To feel deeply about every injustice, every war, every human cost, we were never built for that. The nervous system cannot hold such endless weight. And so, we adapt. We protect ourselves. We grow numb. The noise becomes background. The faces blur. The heart, to survive, begins to harden, not out of malice, but exhaustion. In this climate, empathy is no longer a given. It must be cultivated, protected like a flame in the wind. Because without it, the world becomes transactional. We see suffering not as something shared, but as something happening to someone else, somewhere else. We begin to speak in numbers instead of names. We weigh devastation against our convenience. And war, once unthinkable, becomes tolerable. Even acceptable. This emotional fatigue is not without consequence. Governments, seeing their people less moved, feel less pressure to act. Aid organizations struggle not just for resources, but for attention. Policies grow harsher. Borders close tighter. The story of the other becomes less important than the comfort of the self. And in this landscape, where empathy fades, the seeds of conflict grow faster. Overexposure doesn't only dull the senses, it distorts them. Repetition breeds familiarity, and familiarity breeds desensitization. What should horrify becomes normal. What should shock becomes routine. We begin to doubt the suffering itself. We call it staged, political, exaggerated. Not because it is, but because to believe it fully would demand more of us than we feel we can give. And yet, somewhere in all of us, there remains the flicker. A part that still aches. A part that longs to reach through the screen and say, I see you. I hear you. I care. The question is whether we can nourish that part in ourselves and in each other. Whether we can learn to sit with pain that is not our own, and not turn away. Whether we can choose, in a world designed to numb us, to remain tender. Empathy will not return through louder cries or more graphic images. It will return through intention. Through communities that take time to feel together. Through education that teaches not just facts, but humanity. Through storytellers who dare to linger, who resist the rush, who remind us that every victim was once a dreamer, a child, a soul not so different from our own. The future does not need more information. It needs more connection. Because wars are not waged by machines alone, they are fueled by our distance, our indifference, our forgetting. And peace, if it ever comes, will not be brokered in silence, but in the quiet recognition that someone else's pain is also our own. In an age of overexposure, choosing to care becomes an act of resistance. An act of hope. Part 37, Hope in the Cracks, Microresistance and the Power of Small Acts. Even as the world seems to tilt toward chaos, even as the headlines grow darker and the fractures deepen, there remain, often unnoticed, glimmers of something else, something softer, something persistent. Hope does not always announce itself with fanfare. It grows in quiet places, in defiance of despair, like wildflowers pushing through cracks in the pavement. And it often begins with the smallest of acts. In the face of global uncertainty and the looming specter of war, it is easy to feel powerless. The levers of policy, the gears of diplomacy, the tides of economic strain, all seem too vast, too distant, too fixed. What can one person do when nations clash and weapons rise? What resistance can be offered by hands that hold no power, by voices that command no armies? And yet, history has shown that the most enduring change does not always come from palaces or parliaments. It comes from the choices made in kitchens, in classrooms, in crowded city squares. It rises when a journalist refuses to look away, when a teacher dares to tell the truth, when a family opens its door to the displaced. It emerges in moments where compassion is chosen over indifference, where truth is spoken even in a whisper, where dignity is defended not with force, but with steadfastness. These small acts, what some call microresistance, may not stop tanks or silence drones. But they create a different kind of force, a cultural gravity that slowly pulls societies toward empathy, toward awareness, toward a refusal to be complicit. A librarian who preserves banned books. A nurse who treats the wounded from both sides. A student who asks uncomfortable questions. Each of these choices, made without expectation of applause, becomes a thread in a larger fabric of hope. There is resistance in listening. In refusing to hate. In reaching across language, across creed, across border. In mentoring a child, in planting a tree, in choosing to stay curious. These are not grand gestures, but neither are they meaningless. They are signals to the world, and to ourselves, that even in times of great uncertainty, the human spirit has not surrendered. Hope, after all, is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to move forward in spite of it. It is the steady breath taken in rubble. The candle lit in darkness. The song sung when silence seems safer. And when these acts accumulate, when enough people, in enough places, choose decency over cynicism, courage over comfort, something shifts. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But undeniably. Wars are not waged only with bombs and maps. They are also waged with the stories we tell, the values we uphold, the everyday alliances we form. And so, if war begins in the hearts of men, as the saying goes, then peace must begin there too. In how we see one another. In what we choose to believe is possible. There is hope in the cracks. In the space between breaking news alerts. In the time taken to write a letter, to hold a hand, to refuse a lie. There is hope in the mother teaching her son not to hate. In the artist painting beauty into a world that has forgotten how to see it. In the worker who insists on fairness even when no one is watching. And in these acts, uncelebrated, unrecorded, deeply human, there lies the quiet power to shift the course of history. Not with thunder, but with persistence. Not with force, but with grace. The future may be uncertain, and the threats we face are real. But in the small acts of millions, hope endures. And in that endurance, there is strength. Part 38, Deterrence or Destiny, is war truly inevitable? The question has haunted civilizations for millennia. Is war an unshakable facet of human nature, etched into our evolution, fated by history, or can it be deterred, reimagined, even transcended? Is conflict the price we pay for ambition, fear, and power, or is it simply a failure of imagination, a collapse of courage in the face of complexity? To consider war as inevitable is to adopt a view of history as a tide, sweeping up humanity in cycles of peace and bloodshed that seem to repeat with indifferent rhythm. Empires rise, clash, crumble, and are replaced by others that walk the same path. The names change, but the stories feel eerily familiar: conquest and rebellion, grievance and revenge. In that narrative, peace becomes the exception, and violence, the rule. Yet deterrence, both as concept and practice, emerged from that very recognition. The horror of previous wars gave birth to efforts to prevent future ones. The atomic bomb, for all its devastation, introduced the idea of mutually assured destruction, a grim equilibrium that has arguably kept great powers from direct confrontation for decades. Global institutions, diplomatic frameworks, and transnational treaties are all tools of a species trying to outmaneuver its own instincts. Still, deterrence is a fragile thing. It rests not only on military strength or diplomatic caution, but on perception, psychology, and trust. Misjudgment can snap it. Ego can erode it. One false assumption about intent, resolve, or reaction, and what was meant to be stable can collapse into catastrophe. The most advanced weapons and protocols cannot compensate for human pride, fear, or error. But perhaps the deeper issue is not whether war can be deterred through force or treaties, but whether humanity can choose a different path entirely. Can we evolve past the logic of domination? Can we rewire the deep cultural narratives that glorify conquest and equate strength with aggression? There are hints that the answer might be yes. The arc of moral progress, slow, uneven, but real, has brought us from public executions to human rights courts, from ritual blood sport to humanitarian law. Societies now widely condemn actions once accepted as necessary horrors. The idea of war crimes exists because we have dared to believe that there are, indeed, rules even in conflict. That belief matters. And yet, believing in peace is not the same as achieving it. Deterrence is not peace, it is restraint. It may prevent one kind of conflict while seeding others. It is a stopgap, not a cure. And while destiny is a convenient explanation for war, it risks becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we assume it will happen, we may fail to prevent it. If we view war as inescapable, we may surrender to its gravity rather than resisting its pull. The real question, then, may not be whether war is inevitable, but whether peace is intentional. Peace requires vigilance, not passivity. It demands investment, compromise, and a willingness to imagine alternatives to domination. It requires education that fosters empathy, media that nurtures nuance, leadership that chooses dialogue over posturing. None of these are easy. All are essential. War feeds on simplification, on the reduction of them to something less than us. Deterrence can hold the line, but only transformation can move it forward. If peace is to be more than a pause between wars, it must be seated in the deepest layers of culture, habit, and belief. It must become more than the absence of violence. It must be presence of justice, understanding, and shared humanity. So, is war truly inevitable? Only if we choose to believe it is. Part 39, Learning from the Brink, Near Misses in Modern History. Sometimes the silence that follows a near catastrophe echoes louder than the catastrophe itself. In the realm of global conflict, the most haunting stories are not those of war waged, but of war narrowly averted, of fingers hovering over buttons, of bombers turned back in the final seconds, of intercepted messages that made the difference between diplomacy and destruction. These moments, scattered throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, are sobering reminders that peace is often not the result of order and control, but of luck and restraint, a delicate balance held together by the thinnest of human threads. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains perhaps the most emblematic of these near misses. For 13 days in October 1962, the world teetered on the precipice of nuclear annihilation. The Soviet Union had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, and the United States, under President Kennedy, demanded their removal, preparing for invasion if necessary. Soviet ships steamed toward the U.S. naval blockade. In Moscow, military leaders grew increasingly agitated. In Washington, generals urged swift retaliation. And yet, amid the clamor of potential doom, back-channel communication, a secret letter, and mutual calculation won out over impulse. The missiles were withdrawn. War did not come. But it very nearly did. And then there are the stories lesser known to the general public, but no less consequential. In 1983, Soviet Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was on duty at a nuclear early warning center when alarms blared, indicating that the United States had launched a missile strike. Protocol dictated an immediate retaliatory response. But Petrov hesitated. He reasoned that a real attack would involve hundreds of missiles, not just a few. Trusting his instincts over the system, he chose not to escalate. Later, it was confirmed, a false alarm triggered by satellite error. One man, doubting the machine, may have saved the world. Such episodes are not relics of the Cold War. In recent decades, with nuclear arsenals still vast and cyber capabilities evolving faster than international norms can keep pace, the risk of a different kind of miscalculation persists. Hacked systems, spoofed radar, deepfakes, and artificial intelligence have introduced new ways for confusion to spread and decisions to be made in haste. The channels of diplomacy are no longer limited to cables and envoys, now they compete with misinformation and online escalation. The more connected the world becomes, the more a single point of failure can trigger global consequences. These near misses are sobering not because they tell us how well the system works, but because they expose how often it nearly doesn't. They show us that deterrence is not flawless, that human judgment can be both the last safeguard and the weakest link. They remind us that the margins are thin, that many of the conflicts we fear most have been closer than we like to admit. But these moments also offer something else, an invitation to reflect on what allowed restraint to win. In each case, someone made a choice, often under enormous pressure, to pause, to question, to seek another path. These decisions rarely fit the mythos of heroism, they are quiet, invisible, and often thankless. Yet they are the essence of leadership, of moral clarity under duress. Perhaps the greatest lesson from these brushes with catastrophe is not just how easily things could have gone wrong, but how they were made right, by the slimmest margins, yes, but also by conscious choice. The future may hold new brinksmanship, new crises, new standoffs that test our resolve and rationality. But history has shown us that catastrophe is not inevitable. The abyss is always near, but so, too, is the possibility of turning away from it. In these stories, we find not just warnings, but hope. The world has been to the edge before and stepped back. And if we understand how, if we remember those who stayed the course of sanity, we may do so again. Part 40, Choosing the Path Forward, Reflections on a World Still in Our Hands. The story of global conflict, past and present, is not a tale written in stone. It is a tapestry woven with choices, of fear and courage, of ignorance and understanding, of division and solidarity. As we reach the final pages of this exploration into the possibility of another world war, we find ourselves not at a foregone conclusion, but at a fork in the road. The path forward is not predetermined by machines, ideologies, or borders. It is shaped, each day, by us. What becomes clear after tracing the fractures and fires of modern geopolitics is that the threat of war has never been solely a matter of weapons. The real engines of destruction lie deeper, in the stories we tell ourselves, in the identities we cling to, in the boundaries we draw between us and them. Technology, power, and alliances may shift the balance of force, but the will to use them arises from something far more ancient: fear, pride, vengeance, uncertainty. But just as war is a human invention, so too is peace. It is not passive, not the absence of bombs or the silence between battles. It is an active creation, a discipline, a constant negotiation of dignity, justice, and shared humanity. And it begins long before leaders sign treaties or soldiers lower their guns. It begins in classrooms, where empathy is nurtured. In parliaments, where courage outweighs posturing. In homes, where the future is imagined without inherited hatred. We now live in a paradox. Never before has the world been so interconnected, economically, technologically, culturally. Yet never before has that interconnectedness felt so fragile. Each ripple, each tweet, each tremor in one corner of the planet finds its echo elsewhere. The old walls of geography no longer protect us. We share the same sky, the same algorithms, the same ecological clock. Our fates, for better or worse, are now intertwined. And so, what are we to do with this awareness? To retreat into cynicism is tempting. To believe that history must repeat itself, that conflict is inevitable, that hope is naive. But such fatalism is itself a form of surrender. The future doesn't demand certainty from us, it demands attention, humility, and an imagination larger than fear. We must learn to hear again, not just our own grievances, but the suffering and aspirations of those beyond our borders. We must cultivate leaders who can carry complexity without succumbing to chaos, who can act decisively without losing sight of decency. And we must hold ourselves accountable, not just for our votes or our opinions, but for the way we speak, the way we treat one another, the way we listen. Because in the end, history is not made by inevitability. It is made by millions of choices, many of them small, many of them quiet, and all of them rippling outward. Every generation is handed a world on the edge, of war, of peace, of transformation. Ours is no different. But what we do next is not yet written. The page is blank. As we close this long and winding journey through the perils of our time, let us remember that doom is not destiny. That progress is never linear. That the future is not a place we arrive at, but a place we build, choice by trembling choice. We are not powerless. We are not alone. And the story is not over. It is, still, in our hands.